Hello, hello, hello. Good morning. I'm Andrew Kohut. I'm the president of the Pew Research Center. Welcome to our in-depth discussion and presentation of data about America's newest generation, the millennials, or Generation Next. For a long time, it's my view that young people were out of fashion. When the baby boomers began to slip into middle age, there was less interest in young people. That was until this generation showed up. And over the past decade, the young people who came of age in the first decade of the new century, millennials, really made their presence known pretty quickly, socially, culturally, and very distinctively by being always connected to the new media and the new information technology. Politically, they were the first generation of young people since the 1970s to vote quite differently than older people. Their votes were of consequence to the change election in 2006 and Barack Obama's victory in 2008. Now, as to their consequence, I might add that while their baby boomer parents made a lot of noise in the 60s and 70s, they never elected anyone except Richard Nixon. And I don't think that's what they had in mind. But this generation did have consequence and did get its way politically, at least for two elections. Our research on this generation began mid-decade in surveys and analysis we conducted in association with Judy Woodruff and the NewsHour for its Gen Next series. And the research that we're going to be talking about today and have carried on ever since was built on that seminal work. Our discussion today draws on a couple of things. First, a new public opinion survey that contrasts the attitudes and behaviors of 18 to 29-year-olds to older generations. But we've also mined more than 2 decades of Pew Research Center surveys and supplemented this by analyses of Census Bureau data and other relevant studies. Now, before going any further, what I'd like to do is to introduce the person who made all of this possible, Rebecca Reimel, President and CEO of the Pew Charitable Trusts. Rebecca is a rare combination of things. First of all, she's super smart. She's entrepreneurial. She's focused on the big issues of our time, and she is an agent of change, believe me. She is also my long-term friend.
Well, good morning, and Andy, thank you for that overly generous introduction. I'm here to do 3 things, 3 very important things. First of all, to welcome you to this discussion of a seminal report on the Millennial Generation. Second, to be the first, I think, publicly to salute Andy Kohut on the new addition to his family yesterday, Roscoe, 4-legged new friend, Andy. I think that's great. And third, to be able to stand here and tell you how proud I am of the 15th year anniversary of the Pew Research Center. So I thought I'd just spend a minute and tell you kind of how it started. It was 15 years ago, and one of my staff came into my office completely dejected. He said, I was really hoping that we would be able to get a speaker from the Times-Mirror Center to come in and to talk about their work and help us with ours. And I said, great idea. I read about them all the time in the press. He goes, they're put out of business. I said, really? That's hard to imagine, given their reputation. And he said, well, yes, it's cost-cutting. So I think remembering that there was serious cost-cutting going on in journalism even 15 years ago. Their accomplishments, especially when you consider that they were being quoted daily in the competitors' media, really they had no peer. So after about 1 minute of soul searching, we reached out to Andy, and as they say, the rest is history. I can't think of anything else that we have done that more fulfills the mission and the mandate of our founders. And I thought I would take just a minute and digress to 1946. Joseph Newton Pew received a telegram. Anybody in here remember what a telegram is? From Look magazine, which had almost the readership of Life magazine. And they were doing a piece on what we can do to improve government. Some things don't change. And what they ask of luminaries of the day is, if you were president, what would be the first two things that you would do? So he would not answer. He was a very private man, and the telegrams kept coming. So finally, he sent one back. Tell the truth and trust the people. The editors came back and said, that's too brief. Again, novel idea this day and time. You need to expand on it. And Mr. Pew, he stood his ground. He sent back a telegram and said, would like my statement to stand as believe full light of day on every subject is appropriate. And I can't think of any greater mission or mandate for us or any better organization to carry that out than the Pew Research Center. Well, 15 years is a long time, and a lot has changed in that time. And just think about it. When the Pew Research Center started, less than a quarter of Americans had a cell phone. Less than 20% had internet access. Hispanics represented about 9% of the population. Today, 16% or more. And in journalism, my gracious, what a change. 50% of the people got their news from the newspaper only 15 years ago. Today, about 34%. 10 million less people watching the nightly news. And as many people in this room know, the devastating cuts in newsroom, 55,000 only 15 years ago, 40,000 or less now. And I believe that's what makes the work of the Pew Research Center even more important. I'm delighted to also be able to express my gratitude to Judy Woodruff, who is going to be here to ably guide our discussions today. She's a friend, a colleague, and we have had a wonderful partnership. And important to remember, it was really Judy's groundbreaking work on Generation Next that started to tell us about this very, very important generation. So let me end by extending my thanks to the entire Pew Research Center staff for their tremendous work and what they do each and every day. I really do believe that they're a national treasure. And Andy, my admiration and my personal gratitude for your many professional accomplishments, but most of all, for our partnership and our friendship. And my colleagues, especially Don Kimmelman and our board and all of our staff, join me in thanking the Pew Research Center for telling the truth and trusting the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. We will be focusing today on the 50 million 18 to 29-year-olds in examining their attitudes and their behaviors, and we're going to be doing three things principally. We're going to look at how these millennials differ today from older people. Pretty standard fare in most survey research and political research, social research. We'll be doing something different as well. We're going to look at how they differ from previous generations of Americans when they were that age, specifically how they differ, or particularly how they differ from Generation X and the older end of the baby boom cohort. Now, we can do that because we have more than 20 years of data, so we can look at today's 30 to 49-year-olds and say, well, what were they like? What were their attitudes? What were their behaviors back in the early 90s? And we can even do that into the 80s for the previous generation, or the tail end of the previous generation. The third thing we'll do is we'll look at how the millennial generation has changed in recent years. Yes, it's a new generation. They've only been around a short period of time, but they're already showing some signs of change, and they're pretty interesting. Our first session, and there will be three sessions, will be to provide a broad overview of the millennial generation, examining their demographics, values, attitudes, and behaviors, and discussing the results of the new survey that was conducted specifically for this event. It will be led by Paul Taylor, Executive Vice President of the Pew Research Center, and the Millennial Project Leader. Our second session looks at millennials, the media, and the information revolution, which they are an integral part. It will be led by Tom Rosenstiel, Director of the Project for Excellence in Journalism. Our final session, the Millennials in Politics, will be led by the Pew Research Center's Scott Keeter and Michael Dimmick. Now let me turn the proceedings over to Judy Woodruff, distinguished journalist and senior correspondent with the NewsHour. And as Rebecca noted, she got us going on this path with her insightful proposal many years ago to Pew and PBS that this was a generation well worth looking into in considerable depth. But before I do that, I just want to tell you about something, or perhaps remind you that at some point you might want to see how millennial you actually are. We have a little test on our internet site which asks you some questions and classifies you on a scale of 1 to 100 in terms of how much your behaviors and attitudes are millennial-like, if there is such a term. I scored 5. Paul Taylor scored 8. But nonetheless, we're going to tell you about millennials. I love it. Judy, you haven't taken the test.
I haven't taken it yet. Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Thank you, Andy Kohut. This is an organization with humility when they tell you their scores and urge you to take the test. I just want to thank Andy Kohut, Andy, for the tremendous work you've done leading the Pew Research Center through this project and every other project that they work on. You truly are, at the Pew Research Center, a national treasure, as Rebecca said, and particularly for journalists who look to you day in and day out for the kind of information that we can trust. And thank you, Rebecca Reimel, for providing the encouragement and the inspiration for this project, but personally for me 5 years ago that led me to get involved and to go on to do the work that we did together. It was the first millennials undertaking. We called it then Generation Next. It remains one of the most joyful reporting experiences of my journalistic career. How many journalists get to travel around the entire country, 17 states, 29 cities, interviewing over 500 young people. I fell in love then with this endlessly interesting generation, something you might say was preordained, since I was already curious about their political behavior. And I am the mother of 3 in this age cohort. They fascinated me then. They continue to fascinate me. And I jumped at the chance when Andy brought up the idea of this prospect of doing this a few months ago and asked if I'd be interested in being involved in some way. I see my job today as getting out of the way so that a dozen or so really smart people can enlighten the rest of us about today's generation of teens and 20-somethings. And before I introduce our first outstanding panel, who are going to give us a portrait of the millennials, here is a 1-minute video peek at what some members of this younger generation had to say when I talked to them back in 2006 and 2007, and then in some follow-up reporting last summer about how they see themselves. Look at these screens.
We have all these skills. We can type faster. We're more proficient with computers and stuff. Change is scary, and the older generation is like already set and settled in their ways, and they're like, we don't want to change. This is good. Why mess with it?
I have this job, and I'm going to go into it with a mindset that if I do a good job, I'll be capable of staying there and learning, and if not, then that's not what's meant to be, and another opportunity will arise.
Not to say it's the right thing, but, to be a single mom and to have kids and work and go to school, it's kind of a typical thing. You make a compromise between the things that you want and the things you have to do, and you figure out how to get it all done.
And you do. You figure out how to get it all done. That's just a sample. And now I do want to move to this especially distinguished panel to kick off the conference. First, I want to introduce the individuals who are going to react to the presentation that you're about to hear, and I'm going to call them up one by one. First, Neil Howe, come on up. Arguably the country's most renowned authority on this younger generation. as well as on the generations that preceded it. With the late Bill Strauss, Neil co-authored a series of groundbreaking books on American generations. They first identified the cohort that we're examining today with the book Millennials Rising, and that was 10 years ago. David Campbell, please come up. Where are you, David? There you are. Hi. Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, and the author or co-author or editor of a number of books on civic engagement, on religion, in politics, and on voting behavior, as well as a book that he and Robert Putnam will publish this fall, examining the religious landscape in the United States. Mark Lopez, where are you, Mark? Right here. Associate Director of the Pew Hispanic Center, a project of the Pew Research Center, formerly an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Mark was also research director there for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, also known as CIRCLE. Allison Pond, right here, research associate for the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, another project of the Pew Research Center. Before taking on this assignment, Allison worked for the International and Government Affairs Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She also worked for the National Crime Prevention Council. And finally, I'm going to introduce the person who's going to lead off this panel with fresh off the presses survey results. Paul Taylor, Executive Vice President of the Pew Research Center. Paul heads the center's Social and Demographic Trends Project, as well as the Pew Hispanic Center. Paul spent 25 years, this is the most important part of his life, as a newspaper reporter, and he is still remembered as one of the very best the Washington Post has ever produced. After Paul finishes, we are going to spend about 45 minutes hearing from the panel, then we're going to take questions from you in the audience for another 30. Paul Taylor, you are on.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We call this report Confident, Connected, and Open to Change, and over the next few minutes I'm going to try to tell you why we chose those words. I'm going to offer a very fast tour of a very broad landscape. This is a sprawling report. We covered a lot of areas. I'm going to drive too fast. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you. Numbers are the lingua franca of the Pew Research Center. I'm not going to pause much to discuss what they mean. That's for the rest of the panelists in this morning panel and the rest of the panelists throughout the day. And I hope all of you, I know Judy very much wants to get the audience involved. So let's go.
Before you get started, I just want to say if any of you at the far end over there want to get a better view, there are a couple of empty tables over here, so feel free to make your way over.
I don't know. Should I move out slightly?
Yeah.
This is...
Go ahead. I'm going to move this back.
This is the most diverse generation racially and ethnically in our history. I think most of us recognize that. We are in the period of enormous change. The face of America is changing. By middle of the century, we will no longer be a majority white country. Hispanics are the biggest driver of that change. In this generation, they account for 19%. But they're only the leading edge of a much bigger demographic bulge. 1/4 of all children born in the United States today is Hispanic. Never before in our history has a single minority ethnic group made up this largest share of our young population. Most people associate Hispanic with immigrant, and indeed the Hispanic presence is a result of one of the great immigration waves in our history. It's different from the previous two. They were European. This immigration wave is now about 40 years old. Half of it is Hispanic, 1/4 of it is Asian, and the remainder is Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. But interestingly about this generation is not predominantly immigrant. Gen X, the next up generation, has more immigrants in it than this generation does. Because this immigration wave is 40 years old, this generation is primarily the children of immigrants. And we did a big report about how young Latinos are growing up. Mark Lopez co-authored it. He'll be talking some about that. This generation, like all Americans, but particularly this generation, has been hammered by this recession. I won't go through all these numbers there, but in the first report we did with Judy, we asked them if you are employed full-time, and 50% said yes. Now it's down to 41%. Another way we can express those figures is through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We looked at how many 18 to 29-year-olds are either unemployed or not in the workforce. And what we find is that 37% of this generation today is either unemployed or not in the workforce. This is the highest share for this age group in nearly 40 years. The last time it was this high, and this is of interest, was 1972. 1972, some bad economic times. It also happened to be the last year that we had a military draft in this country, and there were a lot of young adults who wanted to stay out of the workforce because they wanted to stay out of harm's way, literally and figuratively. Let me take a little detour from the economics to talk a little bit about military service. This generation has grown up in a decade when our country has been fighting 2 wars, and yet it has far less exposure to military service and all the responsibilities and the burdens that implies than any previous generation in American history. Of this generation, today, 2% of the males in this generation, 18 to 29, are military veterans. If you look at the Xers, one generation up, same stage of life, 6% were military veterans of males. The Boomers, same stage of life, 13% were military veterans. The silent generation, 24% were military veterans. So a profound shift here in one of the classic pathways to adulthood. As long as we're on this detour, another important institution where there has been a profound shift is religion. 1/4 of this generation, if you ask them their religion, they say, I'm not affiliated. I have no formal association with religion. That is unprecedented since we've been able to take this polling. It's about half the share of their parents' generation, the boomers, at the same stage of life. Now, we know many people typically become more religious over time, and we will also add, and Allison Pond of the Forum will talk about this, and perhaps David as well, not belonging does not necessarily mean not believing, and if you look at various practices, daily prayer, spirituality, and other things, actually this generation is not that dissimilar. But let's return to the economic story because it's a very profound one. As I said earlier, this is the most unemployed or out of the workforce generation in modern history. There is a positive side to this coin, and there's almost a seesaw here. Most out of the workforce, they are also the most engaged in college, community college, or graduate schools. The highest share in modern history of 18 to 24-year-olds in this case, because that's the classic college-going age, a higher share than ever before are now enrolled in college. It's a tick under 40%. Never been this high. Some of this is classic long-term change. A modern knowledge-based economy sends a message to everybody. You want to get ahead, you better get some credentials. But that trend has been clearly accelerated in the last few years by the recession. Can't find a job anyway, might as well go get a degree or another degree, and we're seeing a lot of that. What is striking about this is that despite this situation, this is a generation that is very confident about its economic future. We all sort of know, any of us who have had teenagers, or some of us once actually were teenagers, we know that teenagers and 20-somethings tend to think they're invincible. Everything is going to work out fine. We see that in a lot of polling data over time. But for this generation to be this detached or this unable to find the first rung on the economic ladder, we ask them a series of questions that we have asked over the years. Do you currently have enough money to lead the life you want to lead, or do you think you will have enough money eventually to lead the life you want to lead? 9 in 10 of this generation say, yes, I'm going to eventually have enough money, or I already do. They are much more optimistic about their own economic futures than older adults are about their economic futures. The older adults who are worried about their 401ks or worried about their retirement, et cetera. On top of that, they're also feeling more upbeat about the country as a whole. A classic question that pollsters have been asking since the beginning of time is, how are things going in the country today? You satisfied or not with the way things are going in America? And there's a line chart that shows on top it's the younger generation, and you'll see over 20 years it's always a little bit more optimistic on that question than are those 30 and over. But the gap is now the biggest that we have seen it in the 20 years that we've been asking this question. So whatever toll on the national psyche that the current circumstances have taken, you've got a recession, you've got a jobless recovery, you've got a financial meltdown, you've got a housing meltdown in terms of values, and you've got 2 wars, it has left a much bigger dent on older adults than it has on younger adults. Okay, they are a connected generation, and this almost goes without saying, but we asked people of all ages in this survey, do you think your generation is unique and distinctive? And all 4 generations, a half to 2/3 said, yes, our generation is unique and distinctive. So that's not an unusual thought. And then we asked why. And the millennials, more so than any generation, the Xers cited technology, but only 12%. By the way, this was an open-ended question. Had we asked this in a closed-ended way, those numbers would have gone way up. But this was unprompted. Fully 24% said something about technology is what makes our generation unique. You see the silence. They talk about their moment of coming of age, whether World War II or the Depression. And I must say, let me take a pause to observe the boomers' definition of their generational identity, work ethic and respectful. And to borrow a phrase that's popular now, I look at that as a boomer and I say to myself incredulously, dude, you know. Either we've had a big personality change over these last 40 years, or there's a whole lot of selective memory going on, because I remember the 60s, at least some of the 60s, and I don't think that work ethic and respectful were at the top of most people's to-do list. I don't think most people had a to-do list. But there you have it. All right, but let's return to the millennials, and clearly they identify. I mean, what's so interesting about technology is this little thing that we all now have in our hands, but they are the leading adopters of. So it's their window on the world. It's their window for information. It's their window for entertainment. It's the platform for their social lives. And in a session this afternoon, we had the great fortune of hearing from Dana Boyd last summer. She's a social anthropologist. And I don't want to steal her thunder, but she made the point to us, and it just made little light bulbs go off. You know, teenagers and 20-somethings need to be where other teenagers and 20-somethings are. And way back in the distant mist of history before the digital revolution, that place was the suburban mall or the soda shop or something like that. Now that place is Facebook. They need to be there because everybody else is there. So it's fused not just into their generational identity, but into their social lives. And it's a very important item in their lives. And you see it here, you know, in terms of social networking profile, where fully 3/4 have one, and that's obviously a much greater share than is the case with older generations. The digital world allows this generation, well, allows all of us, but for most of us, it's a profound and somewhat disorienting change. The idea that everybody can get on a cyber soapbox and say, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing right now, if you're interested, here's what I was doing yesterday, here's a video of what I did yesterday. Everybody really has the ability to share their lives with everybody they want to share it with. It raises interesting privacy issues, I think and norms around privacy that I think we'll discover later. But it has been dubbed by people more clever than me, because of this power, the look at me generation. They take it for granted that everybody wants to look at them, and they have the power to be looked at. And what's interesting is that in this generation, those behaviors are they exhibit those behaviors not only online with the ability to do it, but offline as well. And for this generation, something of a generational badge are tattoos and piercings, perhaps in the way that long hair was for those of us who grew up in the 60s. But the tattoo numbers, there they are. 38% of this generation have a tattoo, and for most, one is not enough. Just to dig a little deeper here with some more numbers, 50% of those who have tattoos have 2 to 6, and 18% have, 2 to 5, and 18% have 6 or more. Piercings in a place other than the earlobe, 23% piercing in a place other than the earlobe. On privacy, of those tattoos, of those millennial tattoos, 70% are typically hidden beneath clothing. Take it for what you will. So we've talked a lot about how these folks are different, these young adults are different. Let's talk a little bit about how they're similar. Here's a classic. We gave folks 7 or 8 things. Say, look, here are big important things in a lot of people's lives. Tell us, what are the most important things in your life? And rank them or or tell us which ones are the most important, next most important. So here's the list we got, and it's a pretty familiar list, as I'll show you. Well, I can leap forward to it. So here's the millennials, and it's parenthood and marriage on top of career success, helping others, and other things. If you look at the same list and you compare how 18 to 29-year-olds and 30 and above answered those questions, there's almost no variance whatsoever. So in terms of life priorities, they are in the same place. But then let's look at behaviors. How many of this generation are currently married? 21%. And again, if you project backwards in time and look at the same stage of life for Xers and Boomers, twice as many of their parents' generation was married at this stage in life, and more than half of, in effect, their grandparents' generation. So they value marriage, they are not rushing to the altar. And then in terms of parenthood, of course, there has been a social revolution on the linkage between marriage and parenthood that these numbers express. In 2007, the last year, we had 40% of all births were to single mothers. That's basically quadruple the figure that was pertained in 1970. This has been a gradual change over those 40 years. The millennials are part of that change. The millennials, more so than any generation, didn't grow up. Only 6 in 10 grew up with both parents. So broken homes, never formed home, reformed homes, it's part of their life experience. And judging from this, they are repeating that pattern, perhaps even more so. All right. Getting near the end here. Open to change. Clearly, their political behaviors, their big support for Barack Obama and his message of change suggested they very much are open to change. But this battery of questions also tries to look at their attitudes towards changing cultural and social and family values. We asked all generations, do you think these newer forms are good or bad for society? And I'm only showing you the millennials' responses here. And they are, in every case, they are more receptive to these newer modes of family arrangements and parenting arrangements than our older adults. That doesn't mean they are approving of them. And interestingly, on single mothers raising children, the majority are disapproving. Only 6% say this is a good thing, 60% a bad thing, and about a third say, neither good nor bad. But in all cases, they are more approving and more receptive to change. They are more receptive to immigration. They are more receptive to interracial dating, et cetera, et cetera. Let me close. I think where Judy closed. I too am the father of a parent of 3. Mine are Xers, or I guess my youngest is a millennial, and I'm like you, very fond of this generation. And reading these numbers, in many ways, made me fonder. They really are an interesting group. Here was something that kind of teed up our interest in this. Back in 1969, at the height of the kind of age-based social conflicts of the 1960s, Gallup asked what was the generation gap question. You think there's a big generation gap between young and old? And Gallup found then 74% of all adults said, yeah, there's a big generation gap. We asked the exact same question last year, and to our shock, we found the number hadn't gone down. If anything, it had gone up slightly, 79%. So what is this about? And we've asked a body of questions since then to try to tease this out. And what we find is, this is a gap, but it's not a war. And it's a much gentler generation gap. And I won't run you through all the numbers, but on all sorts of fronts, what we find is that younger adults, these younger adults, are respectful of their parents and their grandparents. When we ask them, what's the source of this gap, they all talk about technology. They all say, and also we have different moral values. Young and old alike say that. And then we ask them, well, whose moral values are better? And the younger adults agree with the older adults that it's the older adults' moral values that are better. It's hard for me to imagine 40 years ago the boomers saying, yeah, we're sort of different from our parents, and they sort of had it right and we sort of had it wrong. We asked adults of all ages, when you were growing up, did you have a lot of fights with mom and dad? The young adults in this age group had about half the number of fights, as they report, than the older adults report they had with their parents when they were growing up. We asked them about family responsibilities. They clearly see the family in whatever way it either was never formed in the first place, it got broken, it's been recombined. They see the family as the ultimate social safety net. They are living that reality right now in a bad economy. 1 in 8 of them in their 20s has moved back in with mom and dad because they can't find a job. And mom and dad, for a lot of them, now that they're adults, are not just parents, they're actually buddies. They actually do get along. And when you ask them about grandma, and when you ask them, if grandma is in a situation where she may need to move in with the family, is that a family responsibility to take in an elderly parent who wants to move in? The younger adults are much more likely than the older adults or the elderly themselves to say, yes, it's a family responsibility. We're actually coming out with a report next week or next month on the quiet revolution that's going on, the multi-generational family, which went straight down for the decade, the entire 20th century, is staging a quiet revival. These kids are a part of it. It's likely that they're going to be a part of it going forward. So, and finally, when we asked everybody, again, yes, there's a generation gap, but people really don't see that there's generational conflict. Indeed, among all sort of social groups we asked about, the fewest see there as social conflict. So to sum up, this is a generation that I think by all empirical evidence has been dealt a lousy hand. They've got a bad economy. Their family situation started broken, became broken, got recombined, whatever. The political system is looking pretty dysfunctional these days. There are mountains of debt that we're piling on this generation. We sort of all know those stories. So what are they doing in response? Well, in some ways, it's what they're not doing. Are they protesting in the streets? No. Are they taking over the dean's office? No. They're hanging out on Facebook with their friends. They're in school preparing for careers that it's not clear that the economy will deliver unto them. And they're looking forward to a brighter future. And if you read the cover of the Atlantic magazine, you will see that there are a lot of economists who worry that this jobless recovery is going to last a long time, and it will have a lingering effect on these kids in terms of their earnings and their careers for 10, 15, 20 years. That was the case in the early 80s. It may be the case more. These kids are not worried about that. They're putting one foot in front of another, and what they are not doing is pointing fingers at their elders and saying, this is a pretty unholy mess you've given us. What they are doing is putting one foot in front of another and say, we're going to get on with it because it's our future. There you have it.
Great. A lot to chew over there, and I encourage everybody here to read the full survey, the full report, because there's so much material there that Paul has very deftly woven together for us to kick off our discussion. Neil Howe, I want to come to you first because you really are the person more than anybody in the country, as I said earlier, who has studied generations, and especially this one. Paul touched on this at several points, but what are some of the main ways this younger generation is different from boomers when we were younger, Gen X when they were younger, and the others?
Thank you, Judy. First of all, I just want to thank Pew for doing this study. For those of us who have been talking about generations for a long time, it's great to have all of you come out and talk about a generation. Social scientists talk about the cohort effect all the time, but they don't often talk about entire generations. Can you pass me just a... Sure. I'm tethered here and I can't move. Someone wired me up, so I can't move. Hold on one second. Thank you very much. And as well that you use the name Millennial Generation, which is, I recall it was in the late 1980s when Bill and I were writing our first book, Generations, The History of America's Future, which is sort of a generational biography of America going back to the 17th century. And we were wondering about what to name the 14th generation, and we were coming up with different names. And Bill said, well, the first one of them is coming along in 1982. They're going to be the high school class of 2000. And I bet you ABC and all these networks are going to have big shows about the high school class of 2000. What do you say we name them Millennials? So anyway, that's how the name was invented once upon a time. I think it was around 1980. We made some predictions at that time about millennials that no one believed. We said that due to their location in history, this generation, by the time it became teenagers, would cause a huge decline in many of the measures of social pathology associated with youth. We said that the crime rate would go down, teen abortion, teen pregnancy, some of the most dangerous measures of drug use would go down. And indeed, I think that was kind of amazing that by the late 1990s and shortly after the year 2000, we saw all of those indicators shift. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind about millennials. They may say that the boomers have all these values and these boomers are so much more moral people than they were. But it's just remembering that when boomers were coming of age, we had 17 uninterrupted years of declining SAT scores, rising drug use, rising teen pregnancy, rising suicide, rising rates of self-inflicted accidents, rising crime. Of that crime, the share that was violent was rising. Basically, everything moved in that direction. Millennials have been moving most of these indicators in the opposite direction, and that's truly remarkable. I think to answer your question, Judy, just about what makes them different, you have to talk first. This is true of any generation. You have to talk about location and history. Location and history is what shapes a generation. And I think it's very useful to think about that period from the mid-1960s, maybe all the way to the early 1980s, the consciousness revolution, what some historians call America's fourth or fifth Great Awakening, what Francis Fukuyama calls the Great Disruption in American culture over recent decades. That was a period where each generation locates itself in a different way. Boomers came of age into adulthood during that period. And that's when we acquired our reputation for reshaping values, reshaping the culture. We were the counterculture. We were Consciousness 3. We were the greening of America. We were all of those things. And now that we're in midlife, we still think that all values revolve around ourselves. So, back then, any discussion of values back in the 1970s was a discussion about college kids. Older people back then apparently didn't have any values. We never talked about them. And today, most discussions of values today are about midlife people. It's red zone, blue zone, it's culture wars, it's boomers arguing with each other. So boomers always go through their life telling other generations what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong. That's how they're wired. But that was the result of that location in history. Generation X were the children of that period. And that hugely influenced them. They were the throwaway kids, the latchkey and self-care guide kids. And they grew up at a time when when children were basically not wanted. They're also the result of the lowest fertility rate in American history. Fertility rate reached its all-time low around the time of Watergate in 1974. And they grew up at a time when childhood was devalued. I don't know if you recall all the childless devil horror movies of the 1970s. Rosemary's Baby and Omen and Damien and It's Alive. And, they played to pack theaters back then. That was our image of childhood. The millennial generation arrived when the consciousness revolution was over, and I think that is how you define its location in history. Boomers remember it coming of age, Xers remember it as children, millennials don't remember it at all. So Woodstock is an SOL question to millennials today. It's as remote from them as talk about the New Deal is from a boomer like myself. They don't remember it. They don't remember anything associated with it in their own lives. And in fact, when they came along was precisely a time at which childhood was revalued again in America. This was a period, the early 80s, when suddenly things began improving for children. Alcohol consumption per capita among all Americans has been gradually declining since about 1981. Drug use among all Americans have been gradually declining. The abortion rate, the divorce rate have all been gradually declining. I don't know if you recall the early 1980s. It was the year of the yuppie, finally settling down. It was family values. It was cocooning. In 1982, when the first millennials were born, we saw the appearance of baby on board bumper stickers all across America. Right? We'd never seen that before. And suddenly, all those childless devil movies, no one wanted to watch them. It was all these cuddly baby movies. You remember Baby Boom and Parenthood and 3 Men and a Baby started coming out. And then about 10 years later, there were, happy movies about adolescence, movies like Sleepless in Seattle and and Searching for Bobby Fischer. And today, in fact, a very common kind of movie. You see this all the time. These were kids who basically inspired their parents to become better people. And you see this especially now when you have later wave millennials with Xer parents. A typical plot line now is, millennial kid puts Xer dad into rehab or something like that. I mean, it's just, we're used to that today. At the same time this happened, this new image of childhood, came a new protection of children. And this is important to remember. Things like child abuse and what was in their Halloween bags and bicycle, helmets and protective playground materials, all of this became into fashion. Fathers present at the birth of their children, even in the late 1970s, only about 20%. By the late 1980s, thanks to the Lamaze movement, about 65%. Today, it's over 70%. So these were huge shifts. The entire home protection industry, all those gadgets you put on your plugs and your stoves and so on, that was those are self-made devices back in the 1970s. It's incredible to remember. Parents just kind of made those themselves. That became a multi-billion-dollar industry by the late 1980s. So all these things began to shift. And when parents couldn't protect kids personally, they started deputizing government to step in. The last 25 years have seen one of the great child protection movements in American history. Every bit as big as what happened during the Progressive era in the first 2 decades of the 20th century under Roosevelt and Taft. You think of all of the laws now even named after millennials, like Megan laws, or there's now a Code Adam. Some kid is lost in a Walmart, bam, all the doors shut, no one gets in or out until that one child is found. But we're very used to this now throughout our society and culture, this new protection. And let me use that as a way to kind of get in the payoff, I think, of what you were asking. So what are the basic ways that it really differs, this new location in history? One is the sense of specialness. They're special. They're special in the eyes of the media, politicians, their community, and above all, their parents. These kids have been raised with William and Martha Sears attachment parenting. The parents are always around. And we've looked at a lot of surveys comparing parents actually saying, do I spend more time with my kid than my parents spent with me? Back in the 1980s, those surveys showed that parents generally said, no, I don't spend as much time. Today, decisively, particularly with parents of the younger millennials, they say overwhelmingly, I spend much more time with my kids than my own parents spent with me. So, I mean, that's an indicator of what's going on. Teachers, K through 12 teachers, according to the last 6 years of the MetLife survey, say that parents are their number one professional problem. Okay, these parents are in their face constantly. And one of the things I do when I talk to groups about dealing with parents is you can't straight arm them. You can't say to these parents, get out of here, I'm the professional. You've just made your worst enemy if you do that. Okay, they have fear and loathing and hatred in that parent. What you have to do, you have to channel the energy. You have to basically say, okay, together we're going to raise this great child. I'm going to do this, and you're going to do that, and together we'll get it. You have to partner it. This is what colleges are now doing, these huge, elaborate freshman orientations. They pass out the teddy bears, and all those boomers are crying, Some institutions really get it. I don't know if you've seen recently the U.S. Army recruiting slogan. You've seen those ads, right, with the parents and kids that are looking at their careers together. But the slogan really gets it. You made them strong, we'll make them Army strong, right, which is perfect. It's the partnership. And you see this. And now the new message is for employers. Get used to, meet the parent of these. There's going to be a bring your parent to work week. It's coming. And they're on the phone with their parents anyway, so you might as well just meet them. And they're telling their kids things about they should get benefits and make sure you get a pension plan and stay there for the long term and all that. So they're cheerleading for the kids. Anyway, get to know them. But that's one thing that's specialness. The other thing is this sheltering. And this sheltering is huge. They're aware, and you see, for Xers had mixed feelings about sheltering. Because with an Xer, you sheltered him, and two thoughts came to their mind. First of all, they would ask, well, why do I trust you to shelter me? You know, it's that natural skepticism. You know, what's your real agenda here? And the other thing is, what's the message here? I can't take care of myself? You know, that's kind of the exit response. You know, I'm not tough enough. You know, what's going on? The millennials have no problem with sheltering. The millennial response is, I get it. I'm special. You want to protect me. I mean, what's the matter here? I don't have any problem with that. So sheltering is big, and you see that in every institution dealing with young people. Sheltering. What do you mean? What is it?
Protecting, providing for.
Providing protections for kids. In other words, all of these laws and rules and regulations, just look at graduated license laws now in most states where you have to go through this elaborate procedure. Okay, now 2.5 people plus a dog can be in your car while you're driving. Next month it'll be something else. Another huge trend, and I won't spend much time, it's the confidence, and I think you covered that. The incredible confidence of this generation. It's causing them in the midst of the recession not just to take the first jobs that gives them cash, but to say, no, I've got longer-term goals. I'm going to live at home. I'm going to go to school. I'm not giving up that longer-term dream. One huge difference, and this is something that we pay a lot of attention to in this generation, and that is this ethic of teamwork and community. And you see this most dramatically in what they spend most of their time thinking about and doing, which is their technology. And I want to just touch on that because I think it's so important. People often ask the question, how does technology shape a generation? And that's an interesting question, but it's usually the wrong question. The much more interesting and fruitful question is, how does a generation shape technology? Much more interesting question. Because if you look at that, you see who invented the personal computers and why. Well, it was Bill Gates and Steve Jobs in the late 70s, early 80s. Why? Because they wanted to get away from those huge mainframe IBMs that had been designed by their GI generation parents. The idea was that all the information went to the top of an organizational pyramid. Someone crunched the data, and then all the orders went down, right, throughout the organization. Boomers said, no, we each want an individual ThinkStation on our own desk, separate from anyone else, so we can be personally creative. And that was the whole 1984 won't be like 1984 ads, you remember, in the 1980s, and Apple and everything taking off. Gen X took this theme of individualizing and individuating the technology further with the internet, particularly with web commerce and everything they did. But here's the surprise, here's the real trend breaker. Millennials are taking this technology, and to everyone's surprise when they were growing up, you know, when they were growing up, they came home, and the first thing they wanted to do on the computer was, well, they wanted to email their friend, and then they wanted to go on the chat room, and then it was IM, and then it was Facebook and MySpace, and now it's these cell phones which have a little Marauders map. You can track every single one of your buddies all day, 24/7. But the point is they're moving technology back to the community. And in fact, they're revitalizing and galvanizing political campaigns and community action through technology. This was not designed or anticipated by older people. This was driven by young people. And you see this in hugely higher rates of community service and volunteering. I mean, let's face it, for Gen X, volunteering was a punishment. You know, you did something wrong in college, you do community service. And the Gen Xer would say, why me of all people, you know? But the millennials, it's more of a norm. And so that is huge. And maybe just one last thing to comment on is how conventional this generation is. Conventional in a very important way, and it often surprises boomers. You ask them what they want to do as they get older, and they say, they have very conventional answers. They say, I want to have a balanced life. I want to be a good citizen and a good neighbor. According to the UCLA freshman poll, an unprecedented share say they want to get married and have kids eventually, much higher than it was for boomers. You ask them how they want to spend their time, and they say, I want to spend time with my parents. And it gets back to this whole revitalization of the extended family, which is going on today. And even their attitudes toward issues like gay marriage and minorities getting along with each other is very much driven by this sense that we should all have a place, we should all have a family, we should all be brought into the mainstream. There's a complete absence of the stigmatizing that goes on so often with boomers. And I think in that sense, that underlying that is a great sense of conventionality. They want to take things and make them conventional so that we can all celebrate them, we can all enjoy them, and everyone can fit in and have a place that way. No one has to shock anyone, like boomers were constantly doing at the same age.
Neil, I let you go on a long time because everybody can see he is just a gold mine of history and information about this generation and just some wonderful context that you gave us. David, I want to come to you. I mean, how do you explain, and this picks up both on what Paul and Neil were saying, given the severity of this recession, this economy, where does this optimism, this confidence that things are going to be all right for this generation, what's your understanding of that? Where does that come from?
That's a good question. I suspect if you look at the trend over time, the fact that young people have always been more optimistic than folks who are older, that suggests that there's something simply about being young that makes you more optimistic, which is, given the dismal state of the economic climate, probably a refreshing thing. I mean, I spend a lot of time with millennials since I am a college professor, so these are the people sitting in the seats in front of me, and I certainly see this, a high level of optimism. And I think it goes back to this individualized sense, this personalized sense of this generation, that they're sort of, all the trends that Neil was describing. This is a generation that has had lots of things provided for them in an environment that's been supportive and such, that this is a generation that's been taught that you really can accomplish anything. I mean, I see that in the students that I speak with all the time, that they always have 17 internships lined up and they have all sorts of ambitions and such, because from knee-high to grasshopper, that's the world they've been raised in, that they have been told the world is your oyster, go out and do whatever you want. So and that's in spite of the economy.
Yeah, so it's not like they feel the rug has been pulled out from under them because of the economy. And the what is it, 37%, Paul said, don't have a job.
Now, again, so I think part of that is just youthful optimism that you would find at any point in time, but I do suspect, and again, if you look at that graph we saw, the gap between older and younger and optimism is a little higher now than it has been in the past. That's probably because of this environment in which today's young people have been raised.
Alison, I'm going to ask you to pick up on young people and faith. Again, this is something Paul talked about, but how does the fact that they are less attached to a traditional religion, and yet, it's not just a purely black and white picture there. I mean, they pray more, I gather, than other generations did when they were young. Fill in some of the blanks there about young people and their faith and their connection to organized religion.
Well, you're right that this is a very nuanced picture that we see here. By some key measures, for example, affiliation and attendance, young people are a little bit less religious than those who are older than they are, in some cases significantly less religious. They are also less likely to say that religion is important to them, but when we look at measures of belief, for example, belief in an afterlife, or belief in heaven and hell, or miracles, angels and demons, young people believe in these things just as much as their elders do, and in some cases even more. But as Andy touched on in the beginning, there are several ways to look at this. We can look at these age differences at this point in time, but we can also look at what other generations looked like when they were a similar age. And as Judy pointed out, prayer is an excellent example of this. Young people today, the rate at which they pray is lower than that of older people today. But when you look at these older people when they were young, for example, Generation X in the 1990s or baby boomers in the 1970s, you see them praying at almost exactly the same rate. So there are some aspects of religiosity that are not entirely generational, but that results from the tendency for people to place greater emphasis on religion as they get older. And so we can kind of see that young people may be a little bit less attached to religious institutions, but that this by no means indicates that they are more secular, that for them, faith, they may be navigating it in different ways and coming at it from different angles, thinking about it differently than previous generations.
There's also, if I remember correctly, a stronger interest than perhaps one would expect in some of the evangelical faiths. Am I correct about that? Help enlighten us a little bit about how they're choosing among the different religions that are available to them.
Our data for this report don't speak exactly to that, but there has been quite a bit of work done in looking at how millennials choose and how young people decide how they sort of put together a pastiche of beliefs, and that they are much more open to choosing, finding a set of beliefs in different places, that more likely than previous generations to sort of tinker and put together these different sets of beliefs rather than necessarily subscribing to one religion overall. In terms of evangelical or not, I think one thing that stands out to me that I think is very interesting is that we can talk about millennials as a whole, as a generation compared to older generations, but even the millennial generation, there are big differences within that generation according to religious affiliation, that those who are evangelical do tend to register much higher levels of religious commitment on many of these items than do those who are not affiliated with a faith, for example, and even those who belong to mainline Protestant faiths or to the Catholic faith.
Can I speak to that?
Sure.
So on the specific question of whether millennials as a generation are attracted to evangelical Protestantism as a segment of the religious marketplace, that was the case up until about 20 years ago, that young people were being attracted into evangelical ranks. And so if you look over the long haul from the 60s to the 70s, you do see a slight increase in the overall percentage of Americans who were evangelicals, but much of that growth was concentrated among young people. That, however, ceased to be the case. That is not the case over the last 10 or 15 years. You have seen evangelical churches sort of remain on the American landscape, and anyone who's been to the Saddleback Church in California or the Willow Creek Church in Chicago, these are massive megachurches, will know what I mean. But in terms of the evangelicals attracting the millennials, that does not seem to be the case. It's not that millennials are streaming out of these churches, but they're not being attracted to them the way that young people were in the past. And what that suggests is that there's an opening in the religious marketplace here, that there's a group of people that the Pew reports have described quite nicely, who are young. They're not comfortable with formal religion, but it doesn't mean that they're truly secular. They just haven't found a religious home yet. That suggests to me that there's an opening for religious entrepreneurs to somehow reach that segment of the population. They haven't yet done so, and evangelicalism as it exists today does not seem to be reaching them.
Okay. I want to jump around a little bit because one thing that keeps coming back to me, Mark Lopez, is the diversity, the enormous diversity of this generation, more diverse than any generation. And we heard the statistics a minute ago. How many are Hispanic? Was it 17% of this generation?
19%.
It's jumped to 19 just in the last few years.
Keeps growing.
And growing. Talk about how that shapes who they are and what they think as a generation.
Well, first on the diversity, there's a tremendous amount of diversity among young people. Young people are more likely to be diverse, as Paul pointed out, than older generations. And to give you an example, when we talk about people who are of school age or school children today, about 20%, 1 in 5, are Hispanic. And as Paul pointed out, among newborns, 1 in 4 are Hispanic. At the Pew Hispanic Center, we predict that by 2050, about 30% of the U.S. population will be Hispanic. So when we talk about moving forward, we're going to see a lot of demographic change coming from Hispanics. But one of the interesting things about that is that when you look at growth in the Hispanic population, a lot of that growth in the last decade has actually come from native-born Hispanics. Immigration plays a large role still, but actually more growth in the Hispanic population has come from the native-born. And when we talk about young people, young Latinos, we're talking about young Latinos who are actually, 2/3 of them are U.S. born. So much of the experience that they're having is actually going to be a U.S. experience, not necessarily an immigrant experience. Yet they themselves, about 40% of young Latinos, are the children themselves of immigrants. At least one of their parents is an immigrant. So when we talk about young people, diversity is a big part of this. Now, what are young Latinos like? Because clearly they're playing a large role in defining this generation of young people. And much of what has been mentioned today, I think Latinos are playing a part in that. For example, when we talk about how youth vote, when you take a look at the youth vote in 2004 and in 2008, you'll notice that non-white youth tended to vote differently than their white counterparts. And as the youth population becomes more and more diverse, I think you're going to see a continued sort of difference in how they vote compared to other groups. Young Latinos, for example, voted overwhelmingly for Obama, just as young African Americans did. Young whites did vote for Barack Obama, but not to the same degree that you see among young Latinos and young African Americans. A couple of other things about young Latinos that make them distinct. They're also, just like all young people, very optimistic about the future. They see the future. They see themselves as doing better than their parents. They put a lot of faith and a lot of value in hard work and in education. And so, just like other young people, they're optimistic. And I think that you're going to see that they see themselves as being successful, or at least the future will be successful for them. Yet at the same time, they face a lot of challenges. When we talk about some of those challenges, you'll notice, for example, young Latinos are more likely to be high school dropouts than other young people. Young Latinos, even though they place a high value in education, many of them are not in college, and part of the reason they give is because they themselves have to support their families. To say supporting their families is one of the key reasons why they're not in college. And when you talk about teen pregnancy, young Latinos are actually the ones who are most likely to be teen mothers by the age of 19, about 1 in 4, compared to other groups of young people. So when we talk about Latinos, we certainly see that, yes, much of the growing diversity of America is coming from the Hispanic population, is going to be coming from the Hispanic population in the United States. But to a large extent, young Latinos face many challenges that in some sense distinguish them from other groups of young people.
I want to ask whether it's Neil or Paul, just to talk about how that diversity is shaping their view of the world, their view of each other, politics, and the rest.
Well, I think Neil said it very well. They want everybody to have a place at the table. It's baked into their value system. It's baked into the way they were raised, and it's baked into literally and figuratively who they are. The diversity that those of us our age look at, and we kind of look and say, America really is changing. For them, it's not changing. It's the way America always has been. So it's taken as a given. One of the most fascinating, I think we have this in our report. If you look at interracial dating, and we've been asking this question for 40 or more years, we and other organizations, well, the whole country has come from a place where the idea of interracial dating or marriage was not only a social taboo, it was a legal taboo. Every generation has marched north over the last 40 years on acceptance of that. But every successive generation starts at a higher place, and the millennials start at the highest place of all. It's taken as a given that is part of who we are. And then look at our president today, a product of an interracial marriage. And we actually have a big report out there about African American views, about the whole idea of race, the idea of race and ethnicity, which is actually terribly confusing. It's confusing, as we discovered, to a lot of Latinos who don't quite, am I white, am I black, am I a race, am I an ethnicity? And frankly, I don't think our classification schemes have caught up with the realities on the ground, but ultimately the realities on the ground will change the language.
When Gen X was young, coming of age in the 80s and 90s, one figure of speech used a lot was the idea of a multiracial, multicultural society, suggesting a bunch of discrete races and ethnicities that sort of pulled a little bit in different directions. And that was also an era where, in the commercial culture, you saw a lot of what we used to call salt and pepper ads. People or kids of sort of very different races together. You show a few blacks with whites and so on, and that's how we describe this multiracial or multi-ethnic society. I think that's really shifting now. I think for millennials, there's much more the idea of simply a transracial, a trans-ethnic society in which people represent all gradations. Typically now in the commercial culture, you see ads showing people of undefinable ethnicities, hues that you don't know where that comes from. And I think this reflects the difference in the millennial sensibility. A rising number of them, when it comes to census questionnaires, don't want to answer. The census forces you to say, I'm a this or a that. They're really bothered by that. They don't want to answer it. There's even some resistance that some millennials have talked to me about the way sort of a multiracial and multi-ethnic training is done in corporations, with sort of where people are forced to confront, a lot of the animosity between races and ethnicities. And a lot of the millennials say, why does it have to be so hateful? Why does all this have to be so unpleasant? You have to drag us through all this stuff. We're cool with what goes on here. We don't want all of that bad news and those bad vibes. And I think in that sense, and what truly comes across in the Pew report, which I find really kind of stunning, is the fact that despite the fact that boomers find it so easy to diss younger people, they don't have work values, they're superficial, they don't have an attention span, and they're entitled, and they go on and on, all these things. Every generation, though, agrees that this generation is more racially and ethnically tolerant. That's the only thing that all generations agree on when it comes to a positive trait among today's millennials.
I want to come to the audience, and as I do, just think about what you want to ask the panel. But as I do, just David, quickly, because there's so much to talk about here, we don't have time to cover everything. Is this question of increased civic engagement? Neil talked about how the great contrast with Generation X. What underlies that desire to give to the community, and maybe if it's connected, the belief in government, a surprising positive view of government?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the millennials have kind of a complex view of government. On the one hand, we do see evidence, obviously, that they're a heavily democratic group and that they're happy to call themselves liberals and they're happy to trust government. But at the same time, we don't see them participating much in formal avenues of politics. But we do see a lot of action, as has been described, in community volunteering, which has a different implication for how you think change happens. If you think change happens by changing laws and policies, then you're more likely to be engaged in campaigns and you're more likely to be speaking to elected officials. If you think that change occurs because at a very localized level, people get together and run a soup kitchen, and they're not worrying about what policies led to the need for the creation of that soup kitchen, but they're just volunteering for the soup kitchen, that gives you a very different way of thinking about the way politics works or the way society improves itself or the way society solves its problems. The millennials definitely fall into the camp of a group of people who see change as coming from small groups of people getting together to do things. Now, I say all of that in a very rosy, optimistic, aren't the millennials great kind of tone, and I do actually think there is a lot of merit to all of the community service and volunteering that you find among this generation. But we should not forget that at the same time, many of these kids are doing this because they know that that's the credential they need in order to get into a good college, or in order, once they're in college, to get a good job or to get placed in a good medical school or a good graduate program and that sort of thing. And I know in my conversations with students, we'll often have a debate over just how virtuous we should think volunteering to be. And it's often the young people themselves pushing back on me, saying, well, I don't really know how virtuous this stuff seems to me, because don't people just do it because they feel they have to? In some cases, they're required, and even if they're not required, there's this heavy social expectation that this is what good kids do in order to be accepted into college or get a good job or whatever. And I actually disagree with that. I think that it's very difficult to unpack motivations, and if one of your motivations is, I'm going to do this because it enables me to put a line on my resume, and another motivation is I want to do it because I really do care about the people in the soup kitchen, I think the fact that they're in the soup kitchen working is important, and the fact that there is that cultural expectation is probably, on balance, a positive thing.
The very fact, too, that they actually want to win credentials from big institutions and win the approval of older people by saying they did these things.
That's a good point.
makes them very different from boomers. I mean, our attitude was doing something just to put it on your resume, you know. No way. I'm not going to do that for you. So, I mean, that whole attitude, just saying, I want to please these institutions. You know, I want to do the right thing. I want it all down in this big resume, you know, says something about their approach.
I hope the transcript notes the hand.
Yeah. I want to see how the transcript shows the gesture that Neil Howe just made. All right, I want to open it up for questions, and I am told that I know there's several millennials here actually in the room. Believe it or not.
I thought they were like leprechauns. We didn't really know whether they actually existed. We just talk about them.
I'm told that there's a young man, I don't know whether you have a question or not. I'm just going to call you, identify Mike Brooks with, I think with United Way, involved in campus organizing. Do you want to pick up Mike Brooks on anything you just heard about organizing, volunteering, and so forth, civic engagement?
Well, number one, thanks for having us all here. I'm Mike Brooks. I am so thankful that I am 28 and a half, and I just squeeze right in there, right? So now I can speak on behalf of my entire generation. But I work for United Way Worldwide, and I facilitate our programs on college campuses and with young people and how we get them involved. And I'm super excited that Heather and others are here who are experts in voting behavior of young folks. You raised such a great question about the either or and of civic behavior between voting, between volunteering, et cetera. What we're finding, and if I was a member of our research team, I could give you great evidence of it, but what we're finding is that it's both for young people right now, that they want to volunteer. Millennials are interested in being engaged more actively locally in the soup kitchens, et cetera, but that isn't to the detriment of voting behaviors, but rather that it's an additional way that they can be involved. And of course, what we're finding at United Way, we've been around for a long time, we're working hard on connecting with young folks, is they want to be involved, they just need to be more effectively asked. And that's something that we're trying to work on as an organization ourselves.
Terrific. Okay, I see a lot of hands up. Questions? Who's most eager? How about this gentleman right here? We have a microphone we're going to bring you. You want to give us your name and your organization?
My name is Decker Gongang. I'm with Mobilizing America's Youth, mobilize.org. And we're a millennial-driven organization. We work with millennials and invest in millennials and their solutions. A couple of points. I think it's important that we talk about the diversity of the millennial generation. They're not kids. They're not just students. And we're colleagues. We're peers. And I think it's relevant that there are not that many of us in the room today. I think young people and millennials are looking to be a part of these conversations, both in the research but also in the solutions to work collaboratively. Working with young people at community colleges, at colleges, but also as peers when I was in corporate America, now in nonprofit world, we're looking for ways to solve problems. We're unemployed, we're veterans, we're trying to give back to the communities in our neighborhoods. And so I think it's relevant that we want institutions to look like us, work with us, and we want to partner with you. And I think there's an aversion by our generation to institutions that talk to us. So with the religion and with our kind of traditional civic institutions, we want to see them reflect the change that we're looking for in our communities.
And are you finding resistance to that?
We're finding resistance in the institutions. We want solutions. We don't want names. We don't want titles. We don't want necessarily jobs. I want a bus stop that's close to my community college, and I want to know how to go to the city council to get that bus stop. I don't want to have to join a club, join a newsletter, and kind of become on a board to get a bus stop. And we don't understand, a lot of the young people don't understand that kind of connection. So we want to simplify our democracy. We want to understand it better, and then where we see an efficiency in it, we want to know how to create those efficiencies. So it's exciting to be with Mobilize in the sense that we're able to kind of help young people find those solutions and to build an easier way to get that bus stop.
Anybody want to comment on that? Okay. Let's see. Let's go to this side of the room right here. Hand up. Yes.
Ray Desarega from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. I work with young people who come to Washington, D.C. For internships and fellowships in the public policy world. And my question is in regard to one of the characteristics, which is of racial tolerance that was mentioned in regard to this generation. At the same time, there seems to be a contradiction because if you look at the college campuses, the climate is not necessarily healthy in terms of racial relationships. I was wondering if anybody could speak to that.
What do you mean? Can you be more specific? What?
self-segregation at college campuses, where the black students only hang out, quote unquote, with each other. I would say that, the idea that the ethnic groups sometimes just stay to themselves.
Separating.
Yeah, separated.
Who wants to comment on that? Neil.
Well, one obvious question is that more or less true than it used to be? I mean, any of us who've been around campuses since the 1960s kind of remember that that's kind of the rule, right? On college campuses, the races and ethnic groups often stick together. So the real question, is that happening more now? I have never seen anyone tell me that it has. I don't know, maybe,
Is that measured? Has somebody done research on that? Something that Pew can look into now.
Something that Pew can look into.
I think it's an interesting question, and I'm going to speak a little bit from experience here. And I'm wondering if, to some extent, college campuses are not quite as diverse as a general youth population. When you look at young Latinos, for example, a lot of young Latinos are just not in college, right? They're not in community college, or they're not in a four-year college. But I do wonder if, as the college campuses...
So they're 19% of young people overall, but a smaller percentage of young people in college.
I want to say it's something like 7%, 6%, but
Okay.
I'm not sure about that number. But judging from my own personal experiences, one of the things that I noticed is in campuses where I was a student, where it was much more diverse, there was much more diversity, one didn't have to worry about being identified with one's ethnic identity. You could just be a college student, and you didn't have to be a part of an organization or a Latino ethnic group. When I went to a college campus where I was one of very few Latinos, we stuck together because it was a way of forming our identity. Now, I don't know if that's true for all cases and all campuses, but I do think that, as Ray has pointed out, that there is this self-segregation that happens, and I'm not sure if it's a reflection of smaller numbers or of something else.
Paul.
Let me comment on that from maybe a political perspective. If you look at the sweep of our history, something very profound happened about a decade ago. Hispanics surpassed blacks as the largest minority group in the country. Blacks had been, throughout our history, the largest minority group, obviously with a very special and unique history. Along comes a new minority group, also of color, that surpasses them. That, in a lot of societies, in a lot of moments, that is a recipe for conflict. I think, I think I hear what you're saying, and I think people tend to self-segregate. I would say, as somebody who used to cover a lot of politics, I'm struck by the degree to which these, quote, competing, and maybe that's not the right framework, but these two minority groups have not been in conflict. We know there are gangs in L.A., and we know there are instances of conflict around the country. There have not been conflagrations. And just to return it to the political theater, we had a very, very dramatic presidential campaign, both the primaries and the general election. You'll recall in the primaries when it was a pitched battle between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and they marched from state to state to state. And there were about a half dozen states where the Latino vote was very important and potentially a swing vote. And Hillary Clinton defeated Barack Obama with the Latino vote by about 2-1 in state after state after state. And there was a lot of commentary at the time. Will the Latinos vote for the black candidate because of intra-ethnic rivalries among rival minority groups? And we got our answer 6 months later in November of 2008, overwhelmingly. Now, they didn't vote at 95% the way African Americans did, but I think they were in the high 60s. So, that's not a measure of everything, but it is a measure of something.
Question right here, this young woman. Microphone, there we go. It's coming.
Thank you. This is just a great conversation. I'm Lori Wesley. I represent the Girl Scouts of the USA. We have a research institute and do original research, not only on Girl Scouts, but on all girls. And we also do comparison with boys. We did a piece about 2 years ago called Change It Up, What Girls Say About Redefining Leadership. And what we learned is much of what you've just heard today. Girls want, leadership for what it can achieve. They are not particularly interested in leadership for its own sake. And they want to see big change, and they want to see meaningful change. And when we looked at the girl-boy comparison, Boys were a little bit more interested in leadership for its own sake, for the position, but generationally,
I'm shocked.
There was a real. Heartbeat.
Can I tell a story about this?
We'll note that the moderator said that. But generationally, there was much more interest in change to make the world a better place.
And what age group, just quickly, were you looking at?
We were looking at 12 to 18.
So, teens.
But this was 2.5, 3 years ago.
That's what that.
If I could
Yes.
maybe add a reinforcing anecdote. So first of all, I should note that I am a big fan of Girl Scout cookies to begin with. But my daughter is also a Girl Scout. I have a 13-year-old daughter. And this little story captures, I think, exactly what you were saying. My daughter, I'm proud to say, is the president of the art club at her middle school. And the way that she won this office, which I assure you she did not want, she was truly George Washington, that she did not want this position. But they had the big meeting of the art club, and there were two candidates. Her name was put forward by someone else. The other was a boy who would have been same age, 13 or 14. And the boy stood up and he said, "Well, shouldn't we give some speeches or something?" And my daughter stood up and said, "Let's just do the art." And then somebody in the back said, "I'm voting for her," and she won in a landslide. If I could make a slightly more analytical point, the observation you make about how girls or adolescent girls are perceiving leadership is interesting, because I think it's clear that we are in a period of all the other changes we're talking about. We're also in a period of change where both adolescent boys and adolescent girls are more comfortable with female leadership. And I've been involved in a little bit of research that suggests that one of the things that drives that, not only in the U.S., but also in the rest of the world, is actually simply seeing more viable female candidates running and winning. But actually, it's not the winning that matters. It's the fact that they're viable and running has created a world in which, when adolescents look out at politics, it does not appear to be just a man's game. A lot of people, say that and speculate about it, but it actually turns out there is some pretty good evidence that is what happens.
And we actually do have research on exactly that point. We did a follow-up study after the elections called Leadership Landscape, and it's about the post-election. What we found in the original research is girls and boys both believe in almost equal numbers that girls should be leaders. There was just a great deal of understanding of what the hurdles look like after the watching Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton. Last point to the art story. Yes, collaboration is the watchword for girls in leadership.
Right. All right. Right here.
My name is David Smith. I'm with the National Conference on Citizenship, and we do a lot of research on this issue around our America Civic Health Index, which some of the panelists are a part of. My main question about this generation is sort of backing up on a couple of the comments here about sort of how the millennial generation is engaged more in sort of the service activities versus politics, although when you look at 2006, 2008, you see them becoming much more involved. My question is sort of, is this more of a conscious opportunity cost? Are they sort of looking at institutions that have turned them away or ultimately just been completely ineffective, also looking at the government in that way as well? And have we sort of realized, well, the place that we can have more impact, sort of this leadership, this impact, this big change, is through community-based engagement, through sort of democracy 2.0, where we are identifying our own problems, proposing our own solutions, and being involved on that level. And if that is the case, is this not a call for sort of greater institutional reform for us to appeal to this generation who's looking for a greater opportunity cost?
Mark, why don't you comment on that?
This is I was trying to think of an answer here. I'm not sure if I have a solid answer, because there's a lot of stuff there. From this particular survey that we did of millennials, clearly it's the case that young people do see more of an activist role for government. They believe more in an activist government. We do see all of that in this particular survey. At the same time, though, in this survey, one of the interesting findings is that young people were no more or no less likely to be volunteers than every other generation. At least that's what this particular survey has said. And on some things, like when it comes to expressing their voice, and whether that's through buying particular products or signing petitions and so forth, or refusing to buy particular products, they're actually in the lead in some cases, and really largely in the lead compared to other generations. But at the same time, they're also not as likely to be contacting their government officials. So there's sort of a mixed picture here when it comes to civic engagement, and I think the picture is getting more mixed as we move forward in time. Yes, politics. Young people and their voter turnout rates this last election were high again for a second time in a row. So 2004, 2008 looked great. 2006 looks good as well. We'll see what happens with 2010. Though it does seem like there's some stepping back. If you look at how young people feel about how Obama has changed Washington, they're a little bit more likely to say, he hasn't changed Washington, and part of the reason why he hasn't done it, they're more likely to say this particularly, is because he hasn't tried. Now, it's not that a majority of them say that. Only 30% of those who say Obama hasn't changed Washington say that he hasn't tried, yet at the same time they're more likely than other generations to say that. So I think it's a mixed story on political and on civic engagement.
And we're going to get into much more of that in the third panel. See, right here. Yes.
Rob Shank with the National Clergy Council, Faith and Action. On the question of faith, what do we know about attitudes about proselytization, evangelization, changing one's religion? And specifically, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but what about the rising numbers of Islamic millennials? How does that affect that?
Allison?
To your point about switching religion, that's something that is actually, there's a large amount of religious churn going on in the United States, and among...
Did you say churn?
Churn, yeah, switching from one religion to another, and even more than once for some people. Among young people, they primarily are switching from the religion in which they were raised to no religion at all. There is some other intra-religious switching that's going on, but a much larger proportion of this generation say that they were raised with a faith but are now unaffiliated with a faith than of previous generations.
Do we know why that is? I mean, is there educated guessing going on about why that is, or is it too soon?
I think that it's a great question for research and discussion, actually.
I was just going to suggest, one possible reason could be that they were raised by boomers who themselves were searchers. They were seekers. A famous book by Wade Roof called Seekers. Boomers became believers in what I kind of call serial orthodoxy. You move from one orthodoxy, then you embrace a new orthodoxy, and you keep trying to find the truth. Well, the experience of growing up with that as a kid may be, I think religion's important. I think communities get together and they do, but it may make them phase out a little bit on the importance or the genuineness of the distinctions, as opposed to having a parent who was always with exactly the same, who was always with the same church.
A related factor that's consistent with this is also the fact that one of the strongest, in fact, I believe it is the strongest predictor of a young person turning away from religion, whatever that religion was that they were raised in, is the fact that they came from an interreligious family. So if you have mom and dad of different faiths, and that has been on the rise, religious intermarriage, they're less likely to pass along either mom's faith or dad's faith to the next generation. And that's tied up with the fact that there's just a lot less religious socialization, if you want to use a highfalutin term, going on within the home. It means they're taking them to Sunday school less and that sort of thing.
One other thing, too, to keep in mind, there's a strong phase of life issue here. It's well known, really, of all generations, that the time between when you leave your parents' home to getting married and having kids is a uniquely a-religious time in almost anyone's life. That's when you tend to participate the least in your church. You usually rediscover it with marriage or with your family when you start one yourself.
How about the question about youth and Islam? Is there enough data to be able to answer many questions about that, Allison? Or David? No.
I don't think so. I think the population of Muslims in the United States is small enough, and the young people that are Muslims is even smaller.
Another area ripe for... Okay, so many hands up. I'm going to... Yes, the woman right there, and then I'm going to go to Bill Galston after that. And then we're going to have to take a quick coffee break.
I'm Emily Sheketoff with the American Library Association. You talk about more acceptance of the government. Is there also an acceptance of the responsibility of paying higher taxes to get the resources that they want?
No.
Well, it's a great question. In this particular battery, we didn't pose the question that said, "And will you pay for it?" We asked those questions again and again in more policy-oriented questionnaires. And Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe just as this generation is by and large more pro-government, when you add and you're willing to pay for it, it's going to say yes at higher levels than older adults.
Yeah, but it's one thing to say it on a survey.
It's one thing to say it on a survey. You're
I'll vote for the
right.
guy who's going to raise my taxes.
We did a project for New America, and all the data suggested yes. They say people should pay more taxes, but again, at their phase of life, they may be in a pretty low tax bracket. And, things change as you get older, and I think one other thing to keep in mind, the biggest reason we're going to have to raise taxes, of course, is the age wave and boomers becoming old, and we've got to pay for Medicare and Social Security and pensions and so on. And I just want to throw out the idea that this rebirth of the extended family opens up some fascinating possibilities to renegotiate our whole entitlements bargain. Because with millennials, and polls indicate this, they're more likely than previous generation of youth to say they want to live with or near their parents. And if we have a system where these families are together more, it may lead to all kinds of very positive outcomes for this fiscal problem we face.
Of helping take care,
Exactly.
Perhaps, of their parents and maybe even their grandparents. All right, Bill Galston, you get the last question, then we're going to take a break.
Well, in surveys like this, I'm always on the lookout for big surprises. And let me just share with you my biggest surprise to see whether anybody else is surprised and what sort of explanation there may be. Buried on page 106.
There will be a test.
Right. Are two questions. Number one, government should do more to protect morality. And number two, houses of worship should express views on social and political issues. On each of those questions, the millennials are substantially more likely to answer in the affirmative than any other age cohort. We're talking about very large ends here. So we're talking about 5, 7, 8, 10 percentage points. Those are large, significant differences.
Could you repeat those two questions again? I don't have page 106 in front of me.
Certainly. Government should do more to protect morality. Millennials are 45, boomers 35. Houses of worship should express views on social and political issues. Millennials 55, boomers 47. And the millennials are significantly more affirmative on those two questions, which are affiliated with, typically, in boomer discourse, the conservative view of things. So what's going on here?
So even though they don't belong to these organized religions, they're saying houses of worship. They're saying
let's love for everybody. Let me take a first whack at it. They are. We said earlier they are more pro-government. It seems to me what you're finding here is they are more pro-institution. One of the really fascinating findings here is on measures of social trust, they are very low. They are lower than older adults. And whether it's because they were raised by these very protective parents, or whether because they were raised in the era of terror, or raised in a media that conveys the mean world syndrome, they believe it's a mean world out there. It's a classic social science question. Do you think people can generally be trusted, or you think when you're dealing with other people, you can't be too careful? 2/3 of millennials say you can't be too careful. So it's a mean world, it's a bad world. 9/11 told them it's a mean world. Columbine tells them that. The major experiences of their life. And whereas the boomers looked to institutions and said, boy, you've screwed everything up, they look to institutions and say, you got to protect us. Our parents got to protect us. Our government has to protect us, and our houses of worship have got to protect us. So that would be my take on it.
Well,
that's interesting, you talk about that lack of trust. The other thing we know about millennials is that they show a genuine aversion to risk. And I think that this is pushing the opposite way that boomers showed. The CDC, actually, you can go to their website. They keep something called Youth Risk Surveillance Indicators. They keep over 50 of them. Buckling up your seatbelt, did you have sex in high school, all kinds of various risk things. The majority of these indicators are decisively down. The ones that aren't are unchanged. And there's only one that's up, by the way, and that's obesity, which is arguably the result of these kids just being kept at home by their parents too much. I mean, the typical Gen X parent thinks the local park is where child molesters hang out or something. But my point is that they're genuinely averse to risk, and that's why they're planning ahead. That's why their first question when they come for a job is not what do I get paid next week, but what are my odds here 3 or 5 years out? How do I kind of plan my life here? But that degree of planning and aversion to risk, I think, might feed into this whole question of not trusting. And of course, they like government. I mean, government's been doing great things for them all their lives. And political leaders are constantly talking about them. So why shouldn't they like it?
Allison, last comment.
Can I jump in on this? I think that Paul makes a great point about this generation being less anti-authoritarian than previous generations. And I also think that these particular questions about the institution of the church, about morality and government, point to something else in the way that millennials are thinking. We know that in addition, that millennials are no less convinced than their elders that there are absolute standards of right and wrong. And at the same time, however, what those standards are may be different, that they believe the government should protect morality, but at the same time, they are much less likely to say that Hollywood threatens their values, for example. So what those values are, what that morality is that they want the government to protect is also a question. And so we can't assume that the ways that baby boomers define morality and the way that they think about religion is the same way that millennials are approaching it. They may have something else in mind.
Did we answer your question, Bill Galston? And Andy Kohut's got a comment.
Bill, I think that the answer to the question about why they're so different on churches should promote their point of view is situation in history. The group that is the least likely to say that are the older people who were raised in an era of more separation of church and state. That's where the variance is. And then the younger generations become increasingly more disposed to that because that's what they've grown up with. So I think this is a reflection of the different realities of these generations. And the real difference in American politics is that these older people who were raised in the 50s and 60s, when, remember, the Kennedy election was, we're going to make these things really separate. That by what our research showed, by the middle of the 1990s, that was forgotten. If it was forgotten by the middle of the 1990s, it's truly forgotten by this generation. Well, I'll stand with their answers. I just wanted to address that.
All right, we are going to take a speed break. 10 minutes, get some coffee, get a bite. We've got a great discussion coming up, and thank these panelists for a terrific discussion. Thank you.
So, where are you located?
Mike Tyson. Just a question I have. It seems that we are overdue for a nation. We've been 30 years now, and looking at, we're 10 years overdue. What is the sense of that emerging generation?
We've played with the dates, and actually, in my most recent book on millennials in K through 12 schools, so they talk a lot to schools, we have a little chapter on them. We had a contest on our website to name the next generation. The winning entry was Homeland Generation. So we call them the Homelanders.
I was thinking Generation Text, but
well,
or the diverse generation, or the virtual generation.
Too tech focused. We wanted the tradition with naming generations to do something that's broadly historical, like the boomers or like the PI generation. But we expect them to be very heavily protected, and their childhood will be shaped mainly by Generation X, just as the millennials have been mainly shaped by midlife boomers. And we
so
see
we're
really
looking
interesting
at a
things.
Much more protected,
hands-on,
even
hands-on
more so
protected.
than the sheltering.
Yes. What we had with millennials was a trend toward more sheltering. Now we're due for about a generation of highly sheltered, just like we had with the silent generation. And if this is
the
a
virtual piece,
think of this. If this is an era, say we have what they're talking about, the L-shaped recession, just kind of goes like that. And if this is an era of urgency and crisis that maybe started with the financial crash of 2008, think of a generation that starts to be born around 2005, say, never remembering or never knowing anything before this period. So that will be their location in history. Much the same way the silent generation, whose first year was 1925, really remembers nothing before the Great Crash. They don't remember the Roaring '20s. Their childhood was the Great Depression. And they were very heavily protected. And the psychic costs, they benefited from that protection, but some of the psychic costs of that protection came out during the whole midlife crisis rage of the 1970s, and they became actually very much a hands-off generation of parents. This was the Gen X childhood. Fascinating, by the way, generational changes. I've been fascinated with that. I've actually looked at data over at the Catholic University, within my own church, and then looking at national data. And it's fascinating how people much more conservative.
We're seeing more disparity rather than.
Oh yeah.
And that's the other question I wanted to ask is that showing up in the research?
In which group?
Well, in the millennials, for one.
We
the conservative,
politically, we actually see this generation as more mainstream in the following sense. If you look at people who self-identify liberal or conservatives, and you look at their views, they tend to be more to the center than older people. If you want extremes, look at them. They have these totally different worldviews.
So is that what's driving more of an
I think
right,
it's
the left,
I think it's boomers. They started the culture war is a boomer phrase to define what they were doing to America, and they love it. Boomers derive great satisfaction from trying to reshape the culture. That's always been their purpose in life since they came of age. And that's
money is coming from and a totally different question.
Thanks.
Hi.
The question has to be anytime we've got a generation. The question is, what's happened over
They don't have
any
it.
research being done on the consequences of that, or attitudes toward doing that isn't digital doing?
Well, the reason for that is very simple. Sorry. Yeah, I better get off this.
I'll do a streaming. Yeah, the streaming video, and I'll do that. I want to see it. Way back in the day, started watching it. Well, that's true. Yes, right. I remember a console. you? Thank you. Thanks very much.
And I noticed that
How do you square that?
Everybody, we're going to try to get started within the next 2 minutes, so please take your seat. We've got a great panel coming up. I'm going to call you guys. Just keep your seat, and then so that way you get started.
I'll get the shades down.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. If everybody would take their seats, we're going to get started right now. Pat Butler.
Nice to see you.
In the audience, I didn't have a chance to come over and say hello.
Doing great. This is fascinating.
It's fascinating.
And you started all this. Look at you.
Listen, I'm happy to have anything associated with it. The few people were the ones who came to me. I mean, I wanted to do something around voting behavior, and they said, what about young people? And I said, yes, let's do young people. Nobody's done it. And it's because they identify, and Rebecca was absolutely instrumental. I mean, they were talking about me, but I mean, they were really.
She's awfully good, and I'm lucky to serve on Andy's board here. You know, back in the old days, the Times Mirror Center for the People in the Press, Don Kellerman and I started that. And we were created from Gallup.
I knew he was at Gallup, and then he came over to the Times Mirror.
That's right.
It's amazing.
Right. So anyway, keep up the good work.
Thank you. All right. All right, if everybody would take their seats, we're going to start right now. Yeah.
To ask about how this impacts the workplace.
Yeah.
The different generations.
Yeah. Good idea. Ask a question, too. All right, we're going to get started. I don't think the mic is on, but we're going to start anyway. I think people are making their way back in, and we're going to let them do that, but we've got a great panel coming up, and I don't want to shortchange them. So if you all could just continue your conversations quietly, we will get started. I want to welcome you back to the second of 3 panel discussions we're doing today, centered on new surveys and analysis by the Pew Research Center on the millennials, the generation of teens and 20-somethings who, as we know, are turning out to be distinctly different from the younger generations that preceded them. One of the things that most distinguishes them, some say defines them, is technology. Their use of cell phones, laptop computers, and not only the internet, but social networking sites to communicate with each other and to learn about what's happening in the rest of the world. When I first linked up with the Pew Research Center about 5 years ago on that reporting project for PBS and NPR to tell the story of this younger generation, I found young people eager to talk about how they interact with new media and how they get information. Here's just a minute's worth of what we heard. Please look at the screen.
I get New York Times delivered daily on email, so I usually do the internet news.
What do I do here? Video games or law school? Video games, law school. Video games are it's a new medium. It's going to be to the 21st century what film was to the 20th century.
I feel like our generation kind of has ADD in terms of we can't just sit down and, let's relax. Okay. I'd say quick, fast, in a hurry is pretty much our motto. We want it now.
Just a small sampling of what we heard. And to elaborate on millennials' media and information, we have another superb panel joining us. And I'm going to call them up one by one. The panel consists of, first, Dana Boyd. Please come up. She is a social media researcher with Microsoft Research. She's also a fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. She has specialized in studying social media, Twitter, blogging, and social network sites like Facebook. She studied at MIT. She recently earned her PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. Dylan Casey, please come up. Where are you? Hi. Dylan is search product manager for Google after a successful career as a professional cyclist, including competing on the U.S. Olympic team. Dylan joined Google in 2002, working on building products for Google Search, and he recently launched its real-time search. 99% of the world is grateful to you, Dylan. I don't know about the other 1%. Amanda Lenhart, please come up. She's Senior Research Specialist for the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which lives under the wings of the Pew Research Center. She directs the project's research on teens, children, and families. Her other research specialties include education, gaming, and network communication tools like mobile phones, social networks, and blogging. And finally, the person who will present Pew's findings on this topic, Tom Rosenstiel. Tom, founding director of the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism. The project specializes in studying the performance of the press, appropriately so, since for 20 years, Tom was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times and for Newsweek. He co-wrote a book on the elements of journalism that has become a Bible for journalism schools and for journalists across this country. Now, after Tom's presentation, the panel is going to trade comments among ourselves for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from you in the audience. Tom Rosenstiel, the floor is yours. And if you'd rather come up here, if you feel this is easier for you, come on up, or you can do it from your chair.
I don't think I can come up.
All right,
I'm
you're
tethered.
chained to your chair, so do it there.
I am where I am. I am who I am. And I'm glad that I'm the oldest person on this panel, so that we have more points of view here. What I'm going to do for just a few minutes is talk a little bit about the media use and news consumption of millennials that we can infer from the survey data and from other data that we look at. We look at a lot of stuff, a lot of data at the PRC. First of all, millennials, I think, as I pour through this stuff, are the leading edge of the spear. They're doing things with technology, and older generations, I think, are following. And we see this over time that they'll do things, and we think that's nuts. That makes no sense. That's crazy. I'd never do that. And then 2 or 3 years later, we do that. How many of the boomers are now on Facebook in this room? As I look through the data, I think that millennials are what I would call on-demand grazers for news. They look for what they want when they want it, and they graze across lots of different sources, although I think a limited number of sources, but they don't rely on a main source for news, I think. They share, they network, they're mobile, they're connected when they're away from home. And as I look through the data, I think they're already changing their behavior, and I think Dana can talk about what she's seen in that regard. I'm old enough now that I can't actually see that very clearly.
Neither can I.
As you can see from this slide, a lot of people think that technology makes life easier. Millennials are a little more likely to feel that way, but this doesn't really define them, I don't think. But one thing where they do jump out more is in the idea that it's a good thing to share all these pictures, to post things about themselves, to say, I'm doing my laundry now while they're on Facebook or whatever. I'm betraying some of my own biases here. I shouldn't do that. Look at the difference in terms of millennials being cell-only. Now, will that change once they buy houses and want to have potentially other phones? Who knows? But right now, no. They're twice as likely to be as Gen Xers and a lot more likely than others. They are connected wirelessly when they're away from home, through laptops, through cell phones, to the internet. And I was trying to take the millennials quiz on my phone earlier, but I don't really know how to work the thing.
I don't know that you should have admitted that since, but go ahead.
It's okay. It's all right. I'm not going to talk about my kids like Paul did. This to me is interesting because look at the change in behavior. Millennials are less likely, a lot less likely to blog than they were in 2007. So I think this is a caution to us that what we see people doing now with technology may not be necessarily what they're going to be doing later. I think the technology, well, I'll talk about this in a second, is not. It doesn't define them as much as reflect them. Millennials are more likely to be on social networks, to use cell and text, but I suspect that the rest of us are moving up, are following them in that regard. They're also more likely to post video, to tweet, but these numbers are not huge. Okay, not everybody is doing this all the time, even in the youngest generation. I wonder what it would be like if we had my 13-year-old daughter on there, but never mind. I wasn't going to talk about my kids. Now we get into where people get their news. Interesting, television, this is both cable and broadcast and local that's in this number. So they're watching television, actually a little more than Gen Xers, but certainly less than older generation. The internet, clearly more. Newspapers, somewhat less, and I think there may be some noise in that lowest number. Radio, interestingly, is something that everybody uses, and the numbers aren't changing a lot over time on radio. So where are people going for news when they are online? Well, this generation is of those who are online at all, 81% are online daily for news. So young people who are connected and who are online get news online a lot. And I think that one of the things that's so fascinating to me as I've watched this research over the years is the idea that young people were not interested in the outside world, I think was wrong. The idea that young people were not interested in the old delivery systems, in appointment viewing, in having to consume your news at breakfast only, that's what was going on. Now that they have a delivery system that meets their behavior, their needs, their personality, they're avid consumers. And the data, I don't have a slide on this, but during the election, this generation was as informed about politics as any other generation. Less so now that politics is working so beautifully here in Washington that they don't have to pay attention. Where are they going online for news? This slide to me is really interesting. They're going to aggregators. Yahoo, CNN, which is a site that's got a lot of material that's not CNN's, Google, MSN, but you look on the right side of that slide at key brands like the New York Times or Fox or any of those. Those are not places that people describe as their main news source. They see the internet as a news source, and what are the options that are available there? In other words, they really are grazers. And we've got research that will be released later that's not part of this report that indicates how widely they graze or not graze. I think they graze, but I don't think they graze everywhere. I don't think any of us do. So in sum, I would say that as I look at the data, but I'm really intrigued to hear what our panelists have to say. Technology reflects the personality of this generation, I think, rather than defines them. But predictions about them are very difficult to make. One reason is because I think millennials are already changing, because because the technology is changing, because their personalities are changing some. The other thing, and this is significant, the landscape is so different that actually asking millennials or any other generation what their media use is like versus what previous generations did is impossible to do, because tweeting and a lot of these technologies didn't exist. We don't know what Gen Xers did when they were 18 in terms of tweeting. We didn't have tweeting then. So some of the data that we can look at in other areas about religious attitudes, about morality, about a host of other things that we can do longitudinally, we can't do when it comes to media use. So I think that we're going to have to turn to other researchers for that kind of thing, which tees up, I think, the rest of our group.
That's great. Thank you, Tom Rosenstiel. And Amanda Lenhart, I'm going to come to you next because you do study this all the time, the use of technology. What would you add to the picture of this generation, how it uses technology? And if you want to, what we heard earlier is that I think from Neil Howe, is that they are taking technology and shaping it the way they want it to work for them. It's not just that they're being used by technology. They are using it to be what they want it to be. So expand on that.
Sure. I think that's a great question, and certainly I think what we've heard today really suggests that teens and millennials, and again my focus is generally on teens, but millennials as well.
And you can make the distinction.
Yeah,
there.
And we'll make the distinction. I'll talk a little bit about some of the differences there, because if we really were doing a full cohort analysis, we'd be going to kids 9 to 20. We'd be going 9 to 29. So there are some things about teenagers who eventually will sort of roll into this cohort that we can talk about how they're different, how they're not different. Though of course there are always time of life issues, particularly with adolescents, and they're more surveilled, they're more controlled lives. Their parents are more in charge of their finances and their choices. But getting back to your question about the technology and how the technology is acting upon young people, I think actually I'd like to step back from that idea and look more at a kind of a holistic feedback loop. That it's not just that we're acting on the technology, because we are, and certainly users and teens and young adults use the technology in the ways that they want, which is often the ways that the designers themselves didn't anticipate. But you're still using the technology as it's presented in front of you. You're still using, you can only really do what the technology allows you to do. So there's a certain element of the fact of how people are designing the technology. And let's remember, it's also Gen Xers and boomers who are designing this technology as well as millennials. So it's all of us coming together using this technology. And so I think you really still are constrained in the ways that you're using technology. And one good example of this is the change that we've seen in the blogging numbers. So, blogging has declined for both teens and young adults since 2006, 2007, quite dramatically. And one of the things we think is a cause of this is the changes in the use of social networks. So back in 2006, MySpace was really ascendant. And on MySpace, blogging was front and center. It was at the top of your profile. It was very easy to do, and you saw other people's blogs. They were updated frequently. It was a big part of the MySpace culture. Fast forward to today, when people are moving to Facebook, not necessarily away from MySpace, as some of the data suggests, but moving over to Facebook and its affordances. But Facebook doesn't have blogging. Facebook allows you to do something called notes, but it's not something that the structure of Facebook presents to you. What Facebook presents to you is actually a much shorter status updates, in fact, kind of a micro-blogging. And that's where we see some of teens and young adults' energies going. So I think it's a mix. I mean, certainly designers are cognizant of what young people want and design things to fit those needs and niches. But at the same time, your use of that technology is constrained by what the technology can do.
Okay, and I see you, Dana Boyd, nodding, and I'm anxious to have you pick up on any part of what she said, but I'm particularly interested in how young people are using social networks, not just to communicate, but it's their community. It's how they,
Sure.
organize friendships and stuff.
I think first off, what Amanda's saying is dead on. And I think that what we've seen is the rise of social network sites have come out at a time where, starting really with teenagers, they're in a social situation where they don't have the same kinds of freedom and flexibility that we took for granted in older generations. And it comes back to what the earlier panel was talking about, issues of a lot of fear. Fear have been unbelievably pervasive in what we've seen with teenagers, and it's continued on into young adults, such that a lot of teenagers that I went and interviewed, they weren't allowed to leave their home, right? This whole thing that we grew up with, be on your bike, get home by dark kind of attitude has pretty much disappeared. And so when one is a fear is a huge component of it. Another big component of it is overstructured time. A lot of, especially more privileged kids in the United States, spend morning to night in activity to activity to activity to activity because their parents think that this is good for them. A lack of geographic mobility, particularly in non-urban environments where they're reliant on parents for cars, where the geography is such that, being out on your bike is not necessarily a way to find where your friends are because of a lot of school choice and a reorganizing of the physical space. And what this all sort of comes down to is a environment where they're trying to find interstitial spaces where they can simply hang out. And so social media came in at a time where young people were looking for places to hang out, and voila, here it is. Here's a place that becomes an online hangout space. And so a lot of the behaviors that you saw, especially with teenagers, but and it continued on, I'll talk about young adults in a second, teenagers looked like what the teenagers were doing whenever we were hanging out before. Conversations boiled down to, joking around, gossiping, flirting, sort of sharing information about what was going on around you. And we look at this, especially as adults, and we're like, this is terrible. How could these people spend so much time doing this completely useless task? And yet at the same time, this is one of the most important learning skills we need out there, which is learning how to actually move around the social world. And so the fact that we've actually taken away in sort of more structured environments and that young people are really sort of pushing to have it is really interesting in that landscape. And they're learning how to make sense of hierarchies and social status. They're learning how to say information and to have it misinterpreted and have to backtrack and figure out how to say it again. And they're working all of that they're doing all that social work, which becomes really powerful. As they switch into sort of young adult spaces and are finally have a little bit more freedom, both because they're finally of age to drive, they're in a different geographic environment, whether they're in the military, off at college, or in a work landscape, we see a sort of switch to more mobile uses. And a lot of the social media really combines with that. So the technology gets used as a way to say, hey, let's meet up, right? Let's gather in these places. The key thing to understand with the social network sites is that they're first and foremost about connecting with people that you already know. And I think there's always this misunderstanding that they're about networking and meeting strangers, which was what, when I was a teenager, that's what I was doing online. But that's no longer the case for most teenagers and most young adults. They're there connecting with the people that they already know or the people they desperately wish to know, i.e. celebrities. And what's really interesting in all of this is that, when adults have spent all this time now for the past 5 years telling young people, this is a dangerous, dangerous place. Don't talk to strangers. Don't talk to strangers. But now I love that all of these organizations out there are now trying to go and reach young people through this social media. You're a stranger too, right? Like, you're just as scary. We've done a really good job of convincing them that all strangers are scary. So we have this sort of interesting inflection in all of the social space. So they're thinking about their different ways of becoming part of public, but it's not public to all people across all space and all time. It's public across their peer groups.
I want to, I do want to move on, but I have to ask you, because it's been raised to me by a number of people, because so much of their learning about social interaction is in front of a laptop computer rather than face-to-face, what are we learning about how they are dealing with people when they have to deal with human beings?
Let's be clear. Teenagers spend, a huge chunk of their day sitting and staring at someone lecturing at them, right? So first off, we've got a structured environment where they're still trying to pass notes and gossip and joke around interstitial spaces that are in person. Once we get out into the young adults, they're definitely interacting with people. And what you hear over and over again from teenagers is, when I ask them, why do you spend all this time online? They're like, because I can't get together in person. Which would you prefer? Definitely getting together in person. But at the same time, so they're doing all of this online, but it's not because they want to be online. It's by and large they want to be in person. They're just having to deal with social sort of situations with which that's not possible. Now, that said, in terms of what they are learning, many of you have your BlackBerries in your pocket. I'm guessing that you've had some really interesting moments with colleagues where you've said something that didn't get interpreted the way you intended and had to deal with the ramifications of it. You had to learn, most likely at an older age, how to navigate textual conversations. So the fact that they're engaging in this means that they're actually engaging in a whole multimodal ways of interacting socially that allow them to interact socially in ways that we expect in the professional world. We don't expect a professional world that is purely face-to-face. We have to deal with the phone. We have to deal with text. Now, they do have some variations about what they think is rude, and I actually think this is a delightful generational difference. For some reason, I talk to older workers in white-collar environments, and they'll talk about, it's so interruptive, it's so rude in the workforce. But somehow getting a phone call isn't, right? It's okay to ring up anybody. And what's amazing is you'll see a lot of teenagers who will text one another and be like, can I call you? It's not saying that texting is always preferred, but there becomes an inverted social norm, which is that this is a lighter touch way of checking in before I've actually vocally interrupted you. So I think we've also got these different expectations based on what we assume are standards, but we're seeing other ways trying to think out the same set of logic about what is appropriate, what is a way of navigating these sort of social and professional spaces.
And just to support Dana's point, we have some data that suggests when given a choice of how to communicate, teens will actually, as she said, will pick the face-to-face. That's the default. That's what they want, and they're still communicating face-to-face even outside of the school environment on a daily basis. But because of various locational and sort of geographic constraints, they go to the cell phone, they go to text messaging and social networks as a default, as a way to expand upon that. So yeah, the numbers basically support Dana's point as well.
Dylan Casey, what would you add to all this, and then bring us gently into your world, your focus at Google on search, and how that's characterizing this generation, how they use search. But I want to make this transition, but I want to hang on to some of the points that we've been making as well.
Yeah, sure. So in my professional life, we don't collect age-specific data about our users, but we do collect a significant amount of data around what people are doing, especially on Google products. And we anonymize it, but we look at it at the aggregate level to try to make some sort of inference on, how are our products being used, how are they performing, which ones are used more often, and how are they being used. And we use that from a perspective of trying to understand what we're doing well and what we're not doing well, or how we might change our strategy in terms of developing new products. But specifically in the search realm, for the longest time we looked at search trends as a way to make inferences about topicality or what was important, or trying to determine geographically based trends. And recently, with this kind of proliferation of what I refer to as a colloquial term, real-time search, is where trends are telling us what people are looking for, and kind of surfacing topics from a perspective or from a dynamic of, hey, I want to find out about this, or I'm interested in this, or this kind of looking for information dynamic. Real-time content, if you look at it at the aggregate level, also allows us to identify what are topics, what's being said on the internet right now. And so it's a slightly different dynamic. And when we spent a lot of time thinking about how we wanted to build the product, and what were the use cases, and who were the users that we were trying to build for, we realized that the reason that we couldn't avoid, because we really tried to avoid this term real-time search. I mean, because, and Dana probably knows from her time ago, like speed has always been important, and real-time has this notion of right this second.
I thought it was already real-time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, all of search and the information that we can gather on the internet and then index and make available through different mechanisms, speed has always been important. But we think, and we've kind of our own analysis and research internally, is that real-time has come about and is important, is because oftentimes the content that is being published via these different mechanisms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or a whole host of different publishing platforms, is generally only useful or relevant for a small window of time. Like, if I say, oh, the traffic on I-95 is really horrible right now, like, nobody cares that I said that a week ago, but you might care if I said that 5 minutes ago or a second ago or an hour ago. And so we really focused on how can we make that. So we focused on the pipeline to get that content and put it in our index, and then make use of it, like make it searchable, make it relevant somehow. And so that whole process, from like thinking about it to actually product launch, involves a lot of thought around how people are using technology, what kind of information and feedback do we get, and it's interesting because we're a metric-driven company. It's all about numbers, and oftentimes we probably don't look externally enough for feedback or input, especially at the level. We're very uncomfortable with doing anything that's based on analysis that is specific to somebody's personal information. Mm-hmm. Right? Privacy is so important to us, and has been from the very beginning. And it's interesting because we have two twists on privacy. Internally, we're completely open with our information. There's no such thing as like secret projects, and because that's the corporate culture, is this idea that access to all of the information about what we're doing and what we're thinking and research and thoughts and meeting notes and stuff like that is essential for us to operate in the way that our founders and executives want us to behave. However, at the same time, we realize that we're in this position of collecting so much information about our users and internet traffic and the internet itself, and understand that if we don't go to great lengths to protect that privacy, then we'll basically just implode internally. And so we have a very interesting relationship with privacy and personal details. And so it creates a certain amount of tension internally to try to understand how do we adjust to what we're being told. Like I have a 4-year-old son who'll probably never, ever understand the concept of a compact disc, right? To him, he's just looking for play buttons. Whether they're on devices or on the internet, he just wants to play music by hitting this button. And so, he's being shaped by technology, and then in turn, he's shaping the way that we develop products because, for example, we recognize that a huge number of searches on Google were music related or entertainment related. And so we said, okay, well, we need to figure out how to, address that. And so we develop products, and now you can go to Google and you can search and just hit a play button. And so there's an interesting dichotomy and interaction ecosystem between how young people that are new to technology and new to accessing information are affected by it, and then in turn how their interaction with that technology affects the actual production and development of it.
Dana. Can I take up the point about privacy? Because it actually makes me think something really critical. There is a large myth out there that young people don't care about privacy. And I think that really needs to be dispelled in all of this. Young people care deeply about privacy, but how they actually think through privacy looks very different than older folks. And I think actually it's more life stage issues than anything else. But we sort of can tease some of this out. First off, there's also a distinction between what we talk about in more industrial conversations about PII, personally identifiable information, and what I talk about jokingly as PEI, personally embarrassing information. And I actually think that the latter is what young people are much more concerned about than the former, right? And they're really thinking through what are the social elements there. The other thing we have to sort of take into account in all of this is what kind of environment they're living in and the kinds of ways in which they interact socially. So, you and I might be having this conversation as friends in the schoolyard, talking back and forth. And, I tell you things, you might forget some of it. Some of it you thought was really interesting and you decide to share with the room. And this is a perfectly reasonable way in which we have regular conversations. Part of it is that this conversation, except for the fact that we're mic'd and cameraed and all sorts of other things, would be, private by default, public through effort. What happens in a social media landscape is an inversion of that. It becomes public by default, private through effort. And so you hear teenagers talk a lot about this and young adults talking about this of like, I write that I'm bored, but, who's going to really pay attention unless they want to talk back to me? So I'll write that I'm bored publicly, not because I'm announcing it to all people across all space and all time, but because I would love to find somebody else who's, bored amongst my friend group who wants to chat with me. But if I'm going to tell Amanda something that's going to really embarrass her, I'm going to take it to a private environment, and we'll really work through that. What this means is with technology, there's an expectation of trust about, just like there is with this conversation, if we had a private conversation and I told you not to tell anybody, and then you spread the entire room, I'd be really angry with you. And it's a violation of trust. It's not the fact that she couldn't do it, it's the fact that I expect her not to. The same thing ends up operating with technology, which is that once the young people have worked out what they think is the social norms of that particular space, when the technology changes the rules, young people get upset. It's not because things weren't public, but making things more public or changing the scale of publicity really does impact them because they're trying to navigate the space accordingly. The other sort of factor in all of this to really take into account is a calculation of what can be gained versus what can be lost. Young people, by and large, when we're taking generalizations, are calculating all of the things they might gain from being public. Being cool amongst their friends, that's a big gain, right? Like maybe getting the attention of, a celebrity, that's a big gain. The possibility of becoming a celebrity themselves, that's a big gain. Most of you in the room, especially those with a political bent, are always thinking about everything you have to lose, right? And that's the calculation you make with these spaces. What's really interesting is that this is inflected by socioeconomic positions more than anything else as we sort of see the transition. So young kids who are on the path to Harvard or Yale or want to be, or their parents have wanted them to be since they were 5, they're going to make these calculations about all that they could possibly lose much earlier than kids who are not really thinking about college, but are thinking about what it means to sort of get attention and get a job that was about publicity. So when we think about all of these issues around privacy, we can't just talk about personally identifiable information, because you know what? They're not making calculations about governments and corporations. They're making calculations about very much intimate and direct power over them: parents, teachers, college admissions officers, potential local bosses. And we have to sort of think about it in that space and why they have certain reactions. So when a technology changes the system, they get upset because of the change of norms.
Okay, we've got a lot of nodding heads and anxious people. I want to let Tom say something, and then Amanda, and I've got a question.
Well, I think one of the things that's important, if we want to bring this back to the question of what people are going to learn about public life and what we call the news. The old media platforms essentially was a form of force feeding. The news was bundled by editors or producers at a newscast or a newspaper or a radio station, and you had some limited choices if you were reading the newspaper, which sections you were going to look at and which stories you'd read. And in television, you had fewer. You had to kind of sit through the whole wheel. I could tune out, and the research shows that I would completely tune out and forget that story that you just did, and I'd remember the next one because it interested me. So what's going to happen now that the news that we can't force feed in the media, and that the news has essentially been unbundled? I, as a consumer, can find the story I want, and the data suggests that that's what people are doing. They don't consume news all at once. They consume it serially through the day, and there are these spikes when people hear something. They get interested and they go look for that story. So what is that going to mean about how society is going to fall apart now that I can't force feed you what I think is important to you? I think what we're seeing in the data suggests that when people decide that something is worth knowing about, they now have the power to go learn about it. The campaign is very revealing. People of many different ages, even much younger than millennials, became excited and became plugged in, became interested, used different channels of technology than had been used for politics before. So in much the same way that speakers or a questioner mentioned, I want to get a bus stop near my community college. That is, I think, how we might anticipate media consumption is going to happen in the future. When I have a problem that I want to learn about, I have the capacity to learn about it. And I have the tools. I know how to use this technology to learn about it. So one of the key things for those of us in the information business, I think, is going to be, how do we make stuff seem relevant? How do we make it clear that this is a bus stop for you?
Do we just give up, though, on the idea that we who know the news business, know about journalism, should decide what's important? And
no, and these guys probably have data on this too, but the data that I've seen suggests that people are still saying what's new. That's, I think, an almost human instinct. And there are phrases for this in different languages. My high school newspaper that I edited was called Habari Gani, which means what's happening in Swahili, and that's a term that that people have in almost every culture. There's some variant of that phrase, and the research suggests that people do go to top headlines. The research also suggests, interestingly, that and this is why there's a war coming with Google. The research also shows that just going to Google and reading the headline, what the news source is, that's the New York Times or whatever, and the first sentence is for many people enough. That I can get a lot of news by just grazing across what you consider to be the appetizer, I consider to be the meal.
Amanda, you want to?
So, yeah, I wanted to actually go back to the point that Dana was making, where she was talking about the difference between public and private, and come back and talk a little bit about some of the places of conflict between young teens or older teens and millennials and older generations around this public versus private. Because I think what happens, and in my own work, I get asked a lot about, well, don't teenagers and don't young adults know that, employers and college people are looking at their profiles? Why do they put all this information out there? And as Dana pointed out, a lot of it has to do with this fact of not necessarily being concerned but having in your mind a particular audience. But I think what happens now is because everything is public by default, there's no way to do what we do in our personal and sort of physical interactions, which is code switch. You know, the way I act to my mother is different than the way I act to Lee Rainey, my boss, and the way I act to Dana Boyd. And when I'm with Dana in person, I can make those calculations and calibrations. But when I present myself in a digital space, I don't have that ability to make those kinds of nuanced choices. Or if I do, it's a little bit of a blunt instrument. It's like a hammer instead of a fine-grained sort of laser tool. And because of this, you get into situations where I think this is an example you used at one point, Dana, where there was a young man, African American, who was wanted to be admitted to an Ivy League institution, and he had gotten in and he had great grades and he was doing really well. And then an admissions officer goes and looks at his Facebook profile, gets access to it in some manner, and sees that he's throwing gang signs and that he is, associating himself with gang activity. And the officer thinks, oh my gosh, we don't want this person to come to our institution because they're going to bring this gang activity. But what we're not getting is that he's doing that to be authentic in his friend group. It may not actually be that he's a member of a gang, but he's doing that to build that kind of rapport and authenticity in his network of peers, which is the audience, and the audience that he's thinking of. So what I think all of us is a big challenge for all of us as we go out and start interacting with millennials, interacting with teens, is remembering that when we look at their online self-presentation through a social network, on Twitter, you're not the intended audience, and that if you're just interacting with this person in another medium, the way they may be showing themselves to you would be very different, and we need to take that into account.
But aren't they now able to make it private much more easily than they used to?
No. Not only are they not able to, Facebook keeps making it harder. So for those of you who didn't pay much attention in December, Facebook changed the sort of default privacy settings and have proudly announced that 35% of the population went out of their way to change the settings. That means that 65% made their material public. And I'm watching this data streaming in, and I'm watching all of it, and it's not meant to be public. And one of the most heartbreaking cases that I actually had to deal with in the fallout of this was a woman whose ex-husband was after her daughter. And they had moved across the country to get away from the situation. The daughter and the lawyer and the mother had sat down in very detailed discussions, talked about how to make this, to allow her to have a life, and then having a life in high school required her to have a Facebook, had really gone out of their way to create a Facebook with her, with all of the privacy settings set down, brought in a tech guy to help sit it out. December rolls around. She didn't know what she was doing. She clicked yes, straight through. Everything was suddenly public. And so one of the things that's really frustrating in all of this is that most people, and Amanda's data shows this over and over again, it's like, yes, there are people that are going out of their way to figure this out. There are definitely people who want it, but the technology is not making it easy.
Very true.
And we are seeing this sort of being a constant conflict, and there's usually a public justification, especially using the rhetoric of young people don't care about privacy. And one of the things I think that really also needs to be highlighted is that the young people who are least privileged in our society have a lot more to lose by a lot of what goes on in these systems. And we really have to think about what kind of structures we need to put in place to help those who are most marginalized.
Aren't we asking, through all of this, underlying all of this, it seems to me one of the points is that we are asking these young people to make these decisions about public-private much younger than previous generations. They're being asked to make some pretty profound or consequential decisions at a much earlier age. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. If you think in the past, we have, think about juvenile records. Your juvenile records can be sealed. If you commit a crime or engage in some kind of activity when you're under 18, that doesn't count when you're an adult. And that's partly because we've decided that young adults and people under the age of 18 at least don't have the same kind of judgment that you do when you're older. And yet now we expect them to have that same kind of judgment in their sort of ability to determine what's appropriate for self-presentation when we don't necessarily expect them to have that kind of judgment in their actions.
And I would argue that actually this is changing for all people of all ages. That we're seeing a lot more persistence of data today ever. And I say that even for those of us who were speaking out in public, right? If you're a journalist out there, you might have written a newspaper article that might have gone into microfilms in some library off there. Now this is easy to pull back of the thing you wrote 10 years ago that, was kind of embarrassing, right? So we're seeing a persistence that goes out. What is challenging for young people is that they're trying to find spaces where there are other young people there. One of the things I'm kind of entertained by is that in most of my interviews lately, I've been reminded that Facebook is for old people. because it's now what's fun about hanging out with your parents is they're reminiscing about their own high school experiences. That's kind of lame. And so we're seeing all of these different inflections about public never meant all people across all space and all time. And I think professionally and socially and personally, we're having to deal with a level of information persistence, information searchability, information replicability, information scalability that we've never seen before.
If they're not doing Facebook, what are they doing instead?
I think they're still on Facebook.
They're just not passionate about it like they were. Their parents are deeply passionate.
It's fascinating. Dylan?
Yeah, I mean, it's true, right? There's probably a lot of photos that I wouldn't necessarily want shared of myself that are in a box in my closet. But for kids today, and for this generation, they're all online. And to both Amanda and Dana's point, it's just behind the click of a button. And that's kind of scary, and there's significant ramifications from that. I agree that it's really important, and it's kind of the responsibility of everybody that is developing these technologies and building these products to really think hard about that. And speaking on behalf of Google, like we spend a lot of time trying to do that, and we make mistakes. And when we do, we try to say, hey, we made a mistake, and we're trying to fix that right this second.
Of course, your friends are now scanning up those photos and putting them on Facebook for you.
Yes, I know.
And all
Judy's got them here; they'll be on screen.
No, but and that's you're absolutely right, and that is just the reality that we live in right now, and we need to figure out ways to have rigorous discourse around what we're going to do about it and how we're going to handle it.
With all of this, I want to try to project ahead to what this may say about this generation as it gets older in the workplace and so forth. So feel free to weigh in on any of that. But as I think about search again, I'm thinking about what one of the young people said in that video that we showed. I remember her very well. Columbus, Ohio. She made the comment about we're just so used to getting answers to everything right now.
Right.
We met another young woman in Birmingham, Alabama, who said we think all the worst problems in the world, whether it's AIDS or anything else, can be solved because we know where to go to get information. We want answers. We want to get it fixed.
Right.
Do you at Google think about these kinds of things when you think that this younger generation is now they've been weaned, they've grown up expecting answers immediately to almost everything?
Well, yeah, I mean, I hear it every single day in one manner or another that speed matters. And, of course, that's probably pretty specific to just some of our products, but I think in general, the notion as bandwidth improves, as access to the Internet improves and more people get access to the Internet, along with that, the importance of how quickly they can get the content that they're looking for becomes important as well. I think, what's interesting, whether it's news or blogs or web pages, to the extent that people can either have a browsing experience where content is just being pushed to them versus when their experience is really around, okay, well, here's what I want to find out about. And there's so many different ways that you can engage with content with those different dynamics, right? Statistically, we see that there are fewer people that are going to the Internet, or at least our properties, just in a browse mode, right? Our news homepage, for example, gets far less page views than an actual news results page. And the reason is because we serve news results pages when people are looking for a specific, or enter a query and we think, oh, well, that's a significant news query. So they get that information interstitial in there. But we see less of that kind of browse. But let me just say a point. But what's interesting is that we also recognize that there is an appetite for just say, hey, just tell me what's happening right now, or tell me some information. And so the speed at which we can deliver that becomes even more important in that specific dynamic.
Well, that previous point you made about, they come to the Internet with an idea in mind of what they want to look for. Where do those ideas come from? Where do those...
Oh, well, yeah, like I reference music a lot because it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. This notion of the top 40, right? Is it the top 40 because those are the 40 most listened to songs, or are those the 40 songs that the record labels want to promote the most? There's research that suggests that people like to listen to music that they've heard before. So that's why this whole feedback mechanism gets created. But then what happens when you start to say, well, here is music based on what people are looking for? And back to your point, to your question, well, how do they know to look for it? Well, the social networks come into play, right? Because it's like a friend of yours. Originally it was, I made this mixtape for you, right? And this was music that somehow I had gathered up in various ways, and I've made a mixtape for you, and I'm giving it to you. Well, now that dynamic has completely changed in the way that people are creating playlists, and that gets stored in their online social profile, and they choose to share that. Well, that has a completely different way of getting disseminated.
Tom, bring this back to news and information and where it comes from and where these ideas get planted in their head. I mean, is it because one of my favorite quotes from a woman, a consultant we interviewed a few years ago for this project, she said, young people, she said, they may not go to news as much as older generations. She said her most memorable comment from I think a young teen was, I don't have to go looking for the news. When something is important, I'll hear about it. My friends will text me or it'll show up on Facebook.
Right. If you look at sort of what was the most important sort of finding in media research in the 20th century, it was that media doesn't tell people what to think, it tells them what to think about. And now that force feeding is changing, they are getting their cues about what to think about from many more places. The authorities that people have may be a friend who they think is cool and has knowledge of things that they are interested in, and says, oh, I like this college, or I think Barack Obama's neat, or I'm interested in this. And that suddenly becomes an agenda-setting influence. So I think that part of it has to do with what's important. What are my problems? What are my needs right now? If you go and you study pedagogy and you go to a room and you say, when's the last time you learned something new? People will tell you about a situation that they were in where they actually had a need to learn this stuff. Now, it may be an artificial need, maybe a test tomorrow, or it could be that you're suddenly on a sailing ship, you've never been sailing before, and you're going to have to learn to tie these knots or you're on vacation and suddenly the Mayans are interesting because you're there and the ruins are in front of you. So I think the issue is going to be, where are the cues coming from? Where are the agenda-setting, influencing things coming from? They're no longer controlled by the media, but the curiosity can be satisfied by the media.
I want to take this up. Over the holidays, I was in a movie theater, and I was delighted to watch two parents clearly arguing about who was in a movie of the past. And the kid kept going, you're wrong. You're wrong. Right? Here's the right answer. And this idea that it wasn't about memory, which was the game of keeping information of the past, but in some ways there were certain things that were facts, and IMDb had them, and parents didn't. And of course the parents kept getting more and more frustrated, being like, but I remember it right. And you're wrong. And so one of the things I think is really interesting is the degree to which young people assume certain things can be acquired and obtained through the digital media. And they don't expect that they have to memorize or remember certain things because it's there somewhere. And this presents us a whole set of new and interesting challenges. First off, anything that Google pumps up at the top is right, regardless of how it was produced or all of the implications of that. And this creates some interesting elements of it, especially as it relates to education, which is that over and over again I spend time in schools where teachers are like, anything in the New York Times is right, anything in Wikipedia is wrong. And I use New York Times for a reason, right? We've had ongoing fraught questions about how news is produced and how we have to think about the truthiness, shall we say, of said news. And I think it's really interesting that what we're also seeing is that at some level, young people, especially younger adults who've gone through college, get that there's something mostly right about Wikipedia, even when things are sort of wrong. And here's what I think is absolutely critical about Wikipedia, which becomes essential for thinking about these kinds of things, which is that every single edit on Wikipedia is publicly documented, which means that you can actually see the history and the biases of all of these people and all of the changes as this article got battled out to make. You don't get to see what happened in the editing room of a newspaper, or how that news story got spun to have a specific kind of headline that, of course, gives a totally different slant to it. And what's really interesting is to think about crowdsourcing as a meaningful means of information aggregation and access. And I think
I don't know what that means.
That taking all sorts of people in to sort of produce it at once rather than having an expert. And so to the news point, what we see in terms of status updates being a source of news is the idea that crowdsourcing, my friends will collectively tell me what is relevant so that things will bubble up as it relates to me. Information around there will bubble up, and it will slowly get worked out and negotiated as sort of more data comes in. And I think we have to think about that changing landscape.
Right. And I think the part that I think about when talking about news, when talking about music, when talking about crowdsourcing, is this idea of digital curation, that in our lives today, in the past it was the news media that curated things for us. It showed us what to look at and where to go. Books and book publishers did the same thing. And now we have a whole bunch of different kinds of curators. We can get our curation from a blog, from that guy whose voice we really like, or from the people that we follow on Twitter, or from the people in our Facebook network, as well as from the mainstream and traditional media. And so I think what's really happening, whether it's crowdsourcing, whether it's Google, whether it's news, is that we're opening and broadening the opportunities for different curators to sort of show their slice of the universe, and you can now pick and choose what you want to hear and who you want to get your information from, and get it from a variety of curated sources. So we still want, I think, our material and our media to be curated. There's too much. The fire hose, Google offers up so much information. Others offer up so much information we can't possibly absorb it all. But having different curators, I think, allows us to get different windows and yet still the kind of customized information we're looking for.
Tom, and then we're going to take questions from all of you, so start thinking about what you want to say or pose to our panel.
I think the point that Amanda and Dana make points to another point about how the news business needs to change, which is that the news used to be basically shoveling information at people. Information is now a commodity in such wide supply that it has limited value, and you can't really charge for it, at least at the moment. But information that does more than simply provide facts to people, that may be unique, that can't be found anywhere else, that authenticates, that accomplishes something more than simply telling you what movie was he in or who was that guy. That's where news organizations that aspire to sort of survive are going to have to go. They're going to have to produce things that I worked at the LA Times for a long, long time, and we had in the left-hand column on the front page, we had something that was called a non-dupe, and a lot of your prestige came from how many non-dupes you did. I'd been there about a year when I said, why is this thing called a non-dupe anyway? And they said, because it's considered a non-duplicated story, something that can be found nowhere else. And essentially, I think that's where the news business aspires to go, because you can't make a living providing information that people can find everywhere.
All right. Questions from the audience, and I'm going to look broadly. There's a young woman right here. You're first. You want to give us your name and if you represent an organization?
Eliza Craigman, National Journal. I'm particularly interested in differences within the millennial generation, and my hunch is that technology has created more fissures within this generation than any other. So I'm wondering if the whole panel could speak to that. And I'd also be interested in hearing Dana Boyd elaborate on the privacy myth and any data that backs that up.
Let's start on the fissures. What do you mean by fissures?
Because blogging was so 2007, that within the millennials there's actually more generational differences. That for instance, I'm 27. I may not relate to how an 18-year-old uses their social networking because it's changes so rapidly. And I'm wondering if any of the data in the study particularly would address that.
All right, I'm going to ask Amanda that, and then I'm going to come back to you for your question for Dana.
So in looking at the data, there's actually quite a bit, and so I spent a lot of time looking across teens and millennials where we could make those comparisons, as well as looking at millennials themselves. And what we actually see with a lot of technologies, particularly social and sort of interactive technologies, that there's kind of this like hump that crosses over teens and millennials, and that it's basically like 15 to 24. There's a kind of an intensity of use, which on either side drops off, partly for financial and sort of parental reasons on the young side, and I think for sort of, again, life stage, family, older millennials are more likely to be married, more likely to be childbearing, and more likely to be sort of in a different life phase. And so that's where we see those kinds of sort of the most intensity of use is kind of concentrated there. In terms of fissures and differences, there weren't a lot between older and younger. There were some that are highlighted in the report. For teens and millennials, the differences, so again, if we're taking the whole cohort, the differences that I would really characterize millennial use of technology as just a little bit more adult. And by that I mean a little bit more free. They're a little less constrained by things like income, since more of them have jobs and money coming in than teenagers do. There's less parental oversight or supervision. So that means you have things with millennials like that they're much more likely to text while driving. They're more likely to have a cell phone, but they're actually less likely to send text messages on a daily basis than teens are. So again, there's some slight differences in there. But again, it's a lot, I think, about income and freedom that really marks the differences between the two groups.
I also think
go ahead.
I also think it's absolutely critical that we highlight that there are huge variations across socioeconomic and racial lines in all of this. And I think that often when we talk about a generation, we obscure the fact that this is really, really significant. And it's often in unexpected ways. And so, for example, I spent a lot of time tracking urban teenagers, low-income urban teenagers for a while, and I was fascinated at how they had what we adults would call smartphones long before their suburban, wealthier counterparts. Why? Because they had picked up the Sidekick. Yeah. And the Sidekick was a really interesting device that T-Mobile allowed you to go, and you didn't have to have a phone plan, and you could have a $30 a month plan, and that would cover all data except for calling. And so that meant that you saw this entire group of low-income, primarily Black and Latino kids in urban environments going to T-Mobile every week, paying their $30, and having a really high-end internet access device long before we saw the iPhone come out. And so the inflections are not always that low-income usage is worse or sort of limited compared to wealthier, more privileged use, but that we have some of these inflections that we need to account for.
And one of the most fascinating pieces in this report, and which actually another report that we're going to be releasing in a few weeks about cell phone use that focuses exclusively on teens, but in this millennials report as well, we see that actually African American and Latino young adults, as well as low-income young adults, are much more likely to go online wirelessly. And if you actually drill down, it's actually on a cell phone or handheld. It's on an iPhone. It's on a Sidekick. It's on a BlackBerry. And we actually saw that through my colleague, former colleague John Horrigan's work about a year ago with sort of the broad population of adults, and that African Americans and Latinos are more likely to use cell phones to go online. And so certainly it doesn't necessarily mean the differences in low income doesn't necessarily mean behind. Did you still have a second question?
Yes, I was interested to hear if there's any data to back up, the privacy point you were making about young people, or what you could elaborate there.
So, I mean, for those who aren't aware, I'm an ethnographer. I do a lot of qualitative work. Amanda and I spend a lot of time going back and forth on qualitative, quantitative. Yes, I have a lot of data on it. Yes, it is very overdue in writing it up, and I'm really apologetic for everyone on that one. Please give me some time. I am desperately working on it. My editor wants me to be not here and working on it more, so I'm working on it.
Yeah. But there is actually data in the report that suggests that millennials, and actually in earlier reports that we've done that suggest that young adults are, and teens in particular, are more likely to protect their privacy by either having their profiles completely locked down or having the profiles visible only to adults. And this is in respect to social networks only. But in general, from focus group work that we've also done, at least with adolescents, there is an actual, a lot of mind share paid towards privacy.
Question over here.
Hi, my name's Scott Swale with the Educational Policy Institute. I have a few bullet points. I think this is tremendously interesting. And I don't know who said it, whether it was this panel or before, but the millennials do something technologically, and then the rest of us at our age group pick it up. I think that's somewhat true, but I looked through some of the responses, and I didn't always see a big difference between what the millennials are doing and what we're doing. Now, I'm 47. I know I look much younger than that, but just go with it. Okay? But, we're all on. Like, in this room, I'd be interested to know who is not on Facebook or something we used to call MySpace, okay, or text. If you're not doing any of those, put up your hands for a moment. Okay, there's a few of you. Okay, there's a few Luddites out here. But the point is that most people are doing this. I'd like to see the results of the study analyzed with business-type people in their 30s and 40s, okay, as opposed to just on the average. Because I bet the millennials probably skew a lot closer to people in the business world than people who perhaps aren't in whiter-collar jobs. I'd just like to get perspective.
Why do you think that?
Because I think anyone in business has to be connected somehow. Like, who isn't checking their iPhone during this meeting or checking their BlackBerry Storm 2 or whatever it is? I just think you're all connected now.
I mean, I think your point is well taken. That in this room, I think we know we are more connected. We're more likely to be connected. And I think the point of these reports is to actually step back and say, let's actually step away from just the people that we know, who we always interact with, and make sure that we're actually sort of looking beyond the beltway, we're looking beyond business, and we're actually seeing what the bulk of people are doing, so that we can understand our own use in the context of that and realize that actually we're kind of outliers in some respect.
But I actually don't know that I agree with your hypothesis. I think that this room is going to be overrepresented on things like LinkedIn. You're going to have a higher percentage of BlackBerries out there than we're talking sort of non-white collar workforce. But one of the things is, I tracked MySpace from its beginning to its rise and sort of watched all of that play out. And what was astonishing to me was in watching MySpace hit, it hit first and foremost, in the adult population, it hit first and foremost with low income and families of color, and not white collar at all. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons that we've narrated it as the dangerous, scary, horrible place, is because it primarily was reflective of more sort of blue-collar lifestyles and practices. I watched a lot of adults that were using these sites engage with their extended families, their cousins, their aunts, their uncles, all of that play out. And I think that in some ways, in some spaces, white-collar folks are not actually at the beginning and the forefront of this. In fact, I think it's really interesting to see when they're not. And I worry that we sort of look to them because I think the media in particular continues to validate white-collar technology practices and sort of disrespects any technology that comes out of low-income or communities of color. And with that in mind, I think we have to just think about the life stage and the expectations. I think one of the things that we tend to see, white-collar folks use it for business. Duh, that's what they're using it for. Blue-collar folks aren't using it for business, but they're doing a lot of family upkeep. And I think that when we look at the social media for that in mind, I think that's really critical.
Fascinating. Question way back over here. Yes, sir.
It's Chuck Rosh from Gannett. This is the reference to Mr. Casey's comment about speed matters, and I'd like to go back to the earlier panel's point about this generation's confidence in government. And I'm wondering, given those two trends together, their expectations on information and what comes from it and maybe what change can come from it, as this generation grows older, is it heading for a sort of a constitutional and expectations train wreck here in the pace of change that can come of this? It's one thing to get information. It's the other thing to deal with a government that was set up constitutionally to be deliberative. And I'm wondering if you've considered this. And then I'd like to ask the entire panel just one other.
Well, let me get that question on the table. I can only handle one question at a time. Sorry. Do you want to take a stab at that, Tom? Start.
First of all, it's a big country, and I think there are levels of engagement that people have. In one of the books that I wrote, I talked about something that I call the interlocking public, which is that we're smarter as a group when you've got people who are marginally engaged, people who are somewhat engaged and people who are highly engaged, because if you only have the highly engaged involved, you get a limited set of interests, and we forget sort of the way that things affect a broader group of people. That we're actually that there is some sort of wisdom in pluralism. I think if the people who are focused on speed get too far ahead of the people who are not as engaged, and say the people who are not as engaged will rise up and say, "Whoa, what are you doing? I don't understand this. Let's not do it." That happens here in Washington from time to time.
Dylan, do you have thoughts on this since you're responsible for the
for the
speed?
comment?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think speed matters for different things in different contexts, right? Like at a competitive level, if you go to one search engine and it takes a long time to get the answer, and you're going to go to the one that gives you the answer the quickest. But there's other scenarios in which if the speed is creating this kind of culture of like we have to get it done right this second, or we have to respond and act and iterate and interact with this feedback mechanism that is so fast. I think that has a separate set of implications that we're all dealing with, regardless of our generation. I'm sure that many of you in the room have to deal with the barrage of emails and phone calls and stuff like that. And to Dana's point, I think what's interesting is to look at the way younger generations are. I'm going to send you a text message before I call you, because this is a social protocol within this one specific group or age group, and I think that's the important thing to think about in regards to speed.
Is there anybody else we've got some really smart people too in the audience, and anybody in the audience have any particular thought on this question of what are we headed for with this generation? Expecting answers right away and dealing with a government that doesn't work that way. I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
This is not a profound insight, so it can be very brief. Dick Yanikoski from Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. Impatience is the prerogative of the young. I think it's always been the prerogative of the young. Their own life cycle is fairly short at that point. Change seems very rapid. When you go from 15 to 16, it's a big event. When you go from 65 to 66, it's not as big an event, at least in social terms. So it seems to me that a part of it is just maturation, that whether they use different technologies or the same technologies or technologies not yet developed, the deliberative sense will come with the responsibility of adulthood. And as the earlier panel mentioned, as maturity sets in, you begin to have a family, you begin to have children, you begin to have voting responsibilities, leadership roles at work or in your community. Deliberation is a natural part of that. So I expect that's where the answer will come from, not from changes in technology per se.
That's a relief. Now, I promised you that's good to know. I promised you a second question. Do you still want it? You're okay. All right. All right. Lots of hands here. Right here. Yes. Is that Linda Wertheimer? I can't see with the light behind you. Linda Wertheimer, NPR.
Linda Wertheimer, NPR. What about gender and technology? How do the two genders use it?
You want to go first, Meta?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and really the way we see it sort of break down, and I'm thinking mostly in sort of content creation terms, is that young women are, and I should say that we are actually seeing some of these boundaries kind of erase over time. But young women are the most intense users of technologies that connect you to others and that are expressive. And the one exception to that is video, where young men are much more likely to engage with, post or watch videos online. I don't know why that is, and if others have thoughts on that, I would love to hear them. And
so you're saying young women are more likely to do social networking, Facebook?
Do social networking, Facebook, to post on a blog, to...
By how much greater?
It's not that much greater. It is statistically significant, but we're talking 5 or 7 percentage points. Again, it is something. It is a distance that is closing, and in some cases has narrowed to a non-statistically significant point in the past couple of years.
What about gaming?
Gaming is the other point, where young men are much more likely to both own the hardware to game and then to play games and to do so for longer.
And I should say, qualitatively, one of the things that we see is that even in these spaces where they may all be using it, such as social network sites, we see differences in the actual details of the practices. Sometimes we see it quantitatively, we definitely see it qualitatively. Even when I was looking at creation, profile creation, I was delighted to find that a lot of the guys that I would meet had their profile first created by a girlfriend. Who had basically dragged them in, kicking and screaming. They may have then sort of engaged with it and then still enjoyed it, but it was different. Qualitatively, when I start to actually track what's going on in terms of their status updates and the content that they're producing, there are differences. There are differences that it's much more sort of social, personal upkeep coming out of the girls. It's much more here's what I'm doing coming out of the boys. And so some of it is just playing out with what you see as for all intents and purposes, traditional gender reproduction.
I have one piece of qualitative research, and that is that everyone in my house can use the clicker now and make every device operate, and that's a sea change.
Is that a gender statement?
For many years, I think the fact that you needed 7 clickers to make the television work, there was a gender difference, and now the technology is more coherent, and everybody can run everything.
Well, we have a gender-blind disability in our household.
I should also, one other thing to note is that, again, when we think about what we value, we tend to also value a lot more boys' work in this space than we do a lot of the girls' work in this space. And I'm seeing, one of the places I'm really seeing
in which space? You mean
in a lot of the online and social media and activities that are going on. And one of the places we actually are seeing this sort of actively play out is around remix culture versus fan fiction. So these are two sort of elite practices where remix culture is primarily coming from the boys, fan fiction is primarily coming from the girls, and the latter is sort of poo-pooed as sort of not that relevant, not that interesting. It doesn't get the same valorization that we have even to the remix culture. So I think that even if we look at some of these different dynamics, we have differences, but we also have what is validated culturally and what is not.
Can you give us a one-sentence definition of what
remix? Say that you took, you saw Monty Python and you saw Star Wars and you decided you're going to make a remix video of the two talking to one another. Right? Classic sort of video reproduction, remix culture. Fan fiction, a classic example would be that you're in love with Harry Potter as a character sketch, and you decide that you're really upset that two of the characters should have been together that weren't together. So you rewrite what should have been using the already existing fan culture. Both are hardcore content production using already existing cultural artifacts. But one is valued much more than the other, and you see that both in how the media is covering it, how scholars are covering it.
And one is textual and one is visual, generally.
Also very true.
And I'd like to know how the fan fiction would translate to Congress, if somebody could think of that. Their favorite member of Congress.
Actually, I will say there are some great games, actually, about re-narrating how certain Congress critters would possibly interact if left alone in other places. It can get really entertaining.
Oh. Okay. Let's see. At this table, that gentleman in the blue shirt, and then we'll go back there and come back. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Dana in particular and the rest of the panel about crowdsourcing. And I wonder, I'm a reporter for the Huffington Post. I wonder how healthy of a development that is from a journalistic perspective. Specifically, my concern is that stories that are very newsworthy, like, say, civil strife in the Congo, get crowded out by stories that are popular. And my concern, I mean, aggregators like the Huffington Post are guilty of that as well, obviously. But I wonder if crowdsourcing breeds a certain complacency in terms of scouting out news and what that means not only for journalists but for consumers of news. And I think it might be incumbent on people like, Nicholas Kristof, for example, does a tremendous job publicizing stories that are very important, but I think this development could very, very well imperil that kind of journalism.
So I think there's a couple of...
And I want Tom Rosenstiel to weigh in on that too, but you start out. Yeah.
I think there's a couple of different things I want to tease out there. There's a difference between reporting and investigative journalism, right? And what ends up getting surfaced up much more is reporting. right? Reporting on a situation, meaning I was here, I saw the Hudson, the plane go into the Hudson. Here's my picture, here's my details and my data, and sort of feeding that into the mill, which is very different than going out and really investigatively understanding a specific situation where you don't have local reporting in different ways. Although actually, it's interesting to see global voices take on a different role in all this. The other component of this, which you're highlighting, is do people pay attention to things that aren't sort of high quality news? Yeah. I mean, if you spend too much time on Twitter, you will watch Justin Bieber trend every 2 to 3 days. For those who don't have to deal with teen starlets, you're a much happier people. But this is sort of a class. This is like the new kids on the block, next generation, right? Like that's sort of these sort of classic starlets that come back. There's no doubt that when given a crowdsourcing decision making, people tend to consume things that are much more gossip-driven, things that are much more celebrity-driven, things that are much less sort of hard news. And I watch a lot of teens and adults do exactly that. But on the other hand, I'm not convinced that they were always watching hard news when they were watching news historically. I mean, I always watch the local news whenever I'm in a new city. And it's amazing if you actually look at it. It's like, okay, there's another fire, there's another cat caught in a tree, there's another. I mean, it's not always sort of hard news either. So I'm not convinced that this is entirely new, but there's little doubt that the drive is to sort of soft news.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this answer short. This is a very complicated issue, but we have precedent. It's not entirely new. And local television news got very focused on minute-by-minute ratings in the 1990s. And you can misinterpret this data, or you can you can focus on things that will generate an audience very quickly, and in the long run actually drive away your audience, because you only focus on stories that generate a lot of attention and drive out the stories that that a lot of different people are interested in. It's what I call the fallacy of 30%. If you do only stories like O.J. and those Michael Jackson kinds of stories, you eventually drive out the people who wanted to get information about this subject, this subject, this subject, and this subject. And imagine a front page where if you had a diversity of stories, you could attract 100% of your audience to at least one of those stories. If you only focus on stories that are blockbusters, you may which attract 30% of a lot of people are interested in them. You drive people away because they don't find the things they're interested in there. The other element of this is the transaction that funded journalism was I would take money from real estate ads and car ads and I'd use it to cover the city council because I thought that was interesting. If the revenue becomes very attached to the specific content, it's not clear how we're going to subsidize the coverage of civic news that may not have a broad interest. At the moment, frankly, this is not a huge issue because there isn't much revenue online for any content. But eventually this could become a very significant issue.
Right here. And then we'll go back over there.
Eli Bears, move on. And this is actually kind of a follow-up. One of the findings in general that I thought was kind of interesting was about the way that this generation is more sympathetic to institutions. And I was curious how that plays with the research I think you all have done about people's trust in the media in general decreasing. And, what do we know about how people attach credibility to pieces of news, especially among millennials? Like what is there much of a difference between having the New York Times brand on there and having a blog post? How does that differ from other generations?
Amanda, Tom, whoever.
We don't have a lot of data about teens' assessment of credibility. I do know that teens certainly value transparency, and I think what Dana was talking about Wikipedia being something that where you can see literally how the decisions get made, I think raises certain questions in the minds of teens and young adults about how news is created, and so I think that that may make them more skeptical, but I don't actually know how that plays out in practice, and I don't know if Tom's shop has done work on that.
You know, what we see is, and the behavior isn't drastically different by generation, I think, but that people are not focused on specific brands. 2/3 of the traffic to the New York Times comes through links rather than people going to the home page. And you know, it's what Dylan was saying too. I think that you know, my own sense is that these are very discriminating consumers, right? They're very proactive. They take command. They understand when there are problems in Facebook. They get irritated. They're very adept. And I think that as they become news consumers, they will begin to become very discriminating about whether that information has value to them. But that's a long-term process, because these are people who, at this point, are not heavy news consumers. I mean, as they become older millennials, yes. But, you know, news consumption has generally, you know, grows as you age. On the Internet, somewhat less, but that function is still there, I think.
To the extent we're told they respect their parents and they look up to their parents in the older generation, do they respect their parents' news sources?
I think they respect Google's judgment about what's a news source. You better get it right.
I know. Well, I was just going to say it's not an easy thing to get right. It's not as simple as saying, okay, well, you know, we should promote this news story because it has the most number of clicks. It's not a simple, like, 1 + 1 math problem. It's a very complicated algorithm. And the reason that it's complicated is because we recognize that it's a really big task to ask computers to try to determine what's important and what's not. And we spend a lot of time and energy and intellectual power on trying to differentiate the significance and importance between popularity and social importance, or what you might think as importance. And there's different ways to try to accomplish that from the user's perspective, whether you rely on your social networks to determine what stories are important, or what content is important, or what is the right search result, or what is the right news story, or whether you rely on your parents, you know, we see that 30% of almost all microblog type updates, whether it's from Facebook or Twitter or MySpace or various other platforms, that contain links to news articles. And basically what's happening is somebody is saying, hey, go read this article, or, you know, to some extent, there's some intent back there, right? And a lot of these platforms are built in such a way that, you know, you're kind of broadcasting to the public, and you're also broadcasting to friends or people that have selected to follow you, or in some cases. So I think it's a very complicated problem. We're not even close to being able to having it solved yet. And I think it's a really interesting to have a discussion around how use of the technology influences the way that the technology is developed to then in turn influence the use. And whether or not something's popular or important, I mean, that's a discussion that we will continue to have forever.
I would just add this, that in our study of new media and blogs and social media, that the vast majority of links that people are referencing are not only legacy media, but these high-prestige legacy media. Like the BBC is enormously significant, and the New York Times, and particular authors, particular writers have real prestige, too. It's not just the institution.
Okay,
one little thing is just like, for those of you who are sort of, especially those inside the Beltway, one of the things we desperately need in this space is we need to talk about media literacy. And we need to talk about media literacy that is both old media and new media, and the combination of which, I feel like if anything, we segment them out into digital media and old school news media. We need to be having a really coherent conversation about media literacy more generally that I fear is not typically happening, especially in the education spaces.
That's something that Pew can tackle.
And there's also, I think, issues, too, around, I think the Kaiser Family Foundation recently did a report that talked about, that looked at media use among 8 to 18-year-olds. And they talked a lot in their report about sort of the shifting of location of consumption of media, you know, from paper to online, from TV to DVR to the web. And so I think we all need to be careful in our work as we move forward, measuring where people are consuming things, making sure that we're casting the broadest net possible. and making sure that when we look at TV consumption by young adults, that we're also remembering that, oh, maybe they're actually watching that and watching news even online.
Online. All right. We can smell lunch. Everybody, I can hear stomachs growling. So I'm only going to take about maybe 2 more questions. Way back there, the young woman with her hand up, and then we'll take 1 more after that.
If you only knew my age. Linda Braun, the Young Adult Library Services Association, and tying in directly with what you were just saying, my brain is sort of going through a disconnect from the first panel to this one, and parents, and that looking up to parents and grandparents, and also that idea of looking for regulation. I'm not sure that's the right word at this point. But, we're in working with libraries and teachers and parents, there's the younger generation is using technology in a different way than others, and also not necessarily looking to them for the kinds of support and help about privacy and safe use that I think you're talking about with media literacy. And I feel like there's a disconnect there. And what do we do about that disconnect? I don't know if you can answer that question.
No,
but that's...
I think there is a huge disconnect, and I think that there's certain things that basically parents have become friends in certain socioeconomic groups, which is a very different set of things than necessarily becoming authorities. Unfortunately, when it comes to topics like safety and privacy, they try to operate as authorities and fail miserably. And one of the main reasons that they fail is that they go back to back in my day rhetoric, which never, ever, ever, ever works, especially in topics that involve new media.
But it's never worked.
That's also probably true. So the one thing that, when I actually talk to parents about how they should engage with youth in social media, I think the key is to actually get out of the fact that we're talking about technology and think about what is it that you're actually trying to help them navigate through. So when it comes to privacy, don't tell teenagers or young adults, don't do this, you'll lose your job. Go and start questions. Say, why did you make this decision? And the moment you get into these conversations that start with questions, you'll get to see the logic that they're going through. It's like, okay, so I understand you're trying to be cute to that really hot boy, but when I see it, I think this. And you start to have this back and forth. The same is true with safety. And Sahara Byrne has been coming up with some really great analysis about how we have this really interesting conflict about how parents are actually approaching their kids around safety issues and creating a huge disconnect in it. And so, you actually have to open up the space to have these conversations, and it really is about communication and conversation. So, also I will say that, unfortunately, while there's definitely some really great data on relationships between parents and kids improving in certain ways, it's not always a rosy picture. And I think one of the most dangerous things that we can do, especially in conversations about safety, is to assume that parents are present and assume that they can actually do the work that needs to be done as a society. And, we are lucky enough to have Michelle Ibarra in the room, who's been doing some fantastic work on documenting this material. And one of the things we know straight up is that the kids who end up engaging in some of the most risky behaviors online and put themselves in situations that, reaching trouble, have other psychosocial problems, have problems at home, have drug and alcohol uses, etc. So parents aren't the magical fix in that space either.
So bottom line is parents need to be doing what?
Parents need to be having conversations and communication with their kids from early ages. It's not about, there's no magic fix. There is no magic fix, and there's no general rule of what you can do to be the perfect parent. It's all about conversations.
And that we as a society need to step in and be there when parents can't be.
All right, one last question. Yes. Yes, you.
Hi, Melissa Sedade from the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University. I've been thinking about...
Center for...
You didn't get that? The Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. We collect data mostly about Catholics and the Catholic Church, etc. Though my question is maybe not related. I've been thinking about privacy, and especially this discussion you've been having on privacy, and Dick Yanikoski's comment about we will grow out of this stage. As an older millennial, and I hate that term, by the way, don't you dare call me an older millennial. When I went to apply for a job, I was sitting down at an interview, and the interviewer had a picture of me and my husband and our newborn daughter, and it dawned on me that I'm Googleable. And I don't suppose I had ever considered that. And I started thinking, oh, I better go through and I better pull stuff down. And then I thought, would it be radical for me to ask, maybe we need to renegotiate that social contract? Maybe it's okay to be Googleable. Maybe it's okay for the workplace to have a fuller picture of me as a person rather than just as a worker. And I think that's in keeping with some of the data that we've seen about millennials in the workplace, which is that they want better work-life balance, they want more satisfaction, they want to be seen as a person and not just a worker. So maybe it's more of that reflective technology going on. Thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that what your example highlights is that you actually provided information to your interviewer that they couldn't legally ask you, which is about your marital status and about your parenthood status. And that's I think really that's a big issue with young adults and with teens. And what does it mean in the future? When are we going to have the Facebook president? And I think we are. And at some point, it'll be interesting to see whether or not our values as a society begin to change and incorporate, and that ultimately that will become a mark of authenticity. Like, what do you mean you don't have a Facebook profile? What were you doing? Where were you? Were you an adolescent ever? And so I think there may be that shift. I mean, we've seen it in terms of drug use in the presidency, for example, in terms of, many, many years ago, you wouldn't have been able to become a presidential candidate or a viable president if you had admitted to drug use. And then we had Bill Clinton, who didn't inhale, and then, onward and onward with George Bush and Barack Obama. And so we've shifted in our values and attitudes towards that and towards what makes you an authentic young person. And so I think we may have to do that with social media as well.
I also think, there's a lot, again, this goes back to what people have to gain from publicness. I'm definitely of the sort of first generation of folks who grew up, I've been blogging for 13 years at this point, right, which is ridiculous. You can find they weren't quite blogs at that point. You can find all sorts of really weird stuff about me, and part of it is living down that past and proceeding with a future and creating a presence that is ongoing. What I have gained personally from being public has been tremendous. But let us note that this is also a point of absolute privilege. I have the privilege to be extremely public and to actually gain from that. And most likely you do as well, in ways that we also have to account for those who are more marginalized by these systems and are coming from systems or going into professions where they are likely to deal with the marginalization. And so one of the questions, which I think is to Amanda's point, is what are we allowed to take into account in our hiring decisions? And I think that we need to have that conversation. When somebody walks into the room, we most likely can read their gender and their race, but we are not allowed to take these into account in a hiring decision. You're not allowed to ask about marital status. You're not allowed to ask about parenthood status. Even if you can get access to this, should you be allowed to actually take that into account? Right? It's not that you can radically erase race from your brain and suddenly not actually think about what somebody's racial identity is, even though you can't ask about it formally. And so we have to actually think about what we're doing with what it means to get access to information and when and where you can use it, and in what contexts we think that this is just absolutely inappropriate.
Yeah, and to echo, I think we can't leave it all up to either, the owners of the technology companies or, to various regulation. Everybody has to take some sort of responsibility for content that they publish and make publicly available. And I think that's just the space that we're in right now, especially, when camera phones came about, right? There was this whole flurry of images that were showing up on the internet that, maybe people thought, ooh, that wasn't so good. Right, and so there's going to be a learning effect from the way that we and all generations use media.
But let's also remember that this is not just what you individually choose to put up there. It's what your kids have chosen to put up there about you. It's what your parents are putting up about their kids. It's all directions. So we can't always talk about personal responsibility either, because we have to deal with people within a broader social situation, and we have to find a way to navigate and give people respect, even when they may have made wise decisions, but the people around them didn't.
Okay, I've now written down about 4 topics for future Pew conferences. And this is one of them. I'm looking at Don Kimmelman. All right, we're going to take another speed break. This one is to get lunch and bring it back here. We're going to resume at 1 o'clock with our next panel on politics. Let's thank this extraordinary panel. You've been great. Thank you.